Subcommittee will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Good morning and welcome to today's hearing, the second in a series to develop legislation to promote competition online and modernize the antitrust laws. Before we begin, I'd like to remind members that we have established an email address and distribution list dedicated to circulating exhibits, motions, or other written materials that members might want to offer as part of our hearing today. If you would like to submit materials, please send them to the email address that has been previously provided to your offices, and we will circulate the materials to members and staff as quickly as we can. I would also like to remind all members that our witnesses that guidance from the Office of Attending Physician states that face coverings are required for all meetings in an enclosed space, such as committee hearings. I expect all members on both sides of the aisle to wear a mask for the duration of today's hearing. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. A free and diverse press is the backbone of a vibrant democracy. Indeed, our democracy is strongest when we have a free and diverse press that informs citizens, holds power to account, and exposes corruption and wrongdoing. But in recent years, the local news that is delivered through newspapers, online, and local broadcasts has been in a state of economic freefall. Over the past 15 years, 1 in 5 newspapers closed, and the number of journalists working for newspapers has been cut in half. In 2019, America reportedly lost over 2,100 newspapers since 2004. Today, at least 200 counties have no local newspapers at all. The crisis in American journalism has become a real crisis in our democracy and civic life. Newsrooms across the country are laying off reporters and editorial staff or folding altogether. While the majority of counties in America are down to just a single publisher of local news, and many lack a local news option altogether. In my home state of Rhode Island, news circulation of our statewide newspaper has declined by 54% since 2004. This is happening to legacy news companies and digital publishers alike. Earlier this week, in the wake of an acquisition, the Huffington Post, a digital publisher, laid off dozens of journalists due to declining advertising revenue. Unfortunately, they are not alone. Last year, digital publishers furloughed or laid off dozens of reporters and other newsroom staff. These layoffs occur at a time when more people are online than ever before, and online readership is at an all-time high. This decline has also accelerated in the wake of the pandemic, at a time when local journalism is more important than ever. As Jonathan Schluss will testify today, and I quote, "We are truly facing an extinction-level event for local news," end quote. If this trend continues, we risk permanently compromising the news organizations that are essential to our communities, holding the government and powerful corporations accountable, and sustaining our democracy. In response to these concerns, the subcommittee examined the effect of market power, the market power in particular of the largest technology platforms, on the survival of a free and diverse press as part of our bipartisan investigation last Congress. During our inquiry, we received evidence about the significant and growing asymmetry of power between several dominant online platforms and news publishers. In numerous interviews, submissions, and testimony before the subcommittee, publishers and broadcasters with distinct business models and distribution strategies said they are increasingly beholden to Google and Facebook, which increasingly function as the gatekeepers for information online. For example, Digital Content Next, which represents digital news publishers and content companies, notes in a statement for the record for today's hearing that 64% of online referrals to its premium publishers came from services owned by Facebook or Google, underscoring the extraordinary role of these companies in how the public discovers, searches, and spreads information. According to the Pew Research Center, nearly 3/4 of Americans get their news online through either Facebook or Google. As news publishers have noted, this gatekeeper power gives Facebook and Google the ability to distort the flow of information online. This means that Google and Facebook can divert their billions of users away from trustworthy sources of news with a single change to their algorithms, or through other subtle but meaningful ways, such as manipulating ad auctions. A second related problem that we identified during the investigation is the market power of these firms over digital advertising. Facebook and Google control the majority of online advertising in the United States, and have captured nearly all of the growth in this market. Each year, advertisers pay billions of dollars to these two companies to serve highly targeted ads on Facebook and through Google's advertising network. Nearly a dozen Republican state attorneys general who are currently suing Google for the monopolization described Google's advertising network as the, and I quote, largest electronic trading market in existence, end quote. These companies continue to enjoy persistently high profit margins, a telltale sign of their substantial and enduring market power. At the same time, news publishers have seen a steep decline in revenue and a reduced ability to monetize journalism, particularly when it comes to these sources online. Overall, the market power of Google and Facebook is reinforced by the unprecedented amount of data collected by these companies, along with other factors that have tipped digital markets in favor of these firms and blocked rivals and new entrants from challenging their dominance. The findings of other antitrust investigations bolster these conclusions. For example, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, which conducted its own extensive investigation into this matter, similarly noted in their exhaustive 2019 report that Facebook and Google have substantial market power over channels for accessing news online and digital advertising. In a statement for today's hearing, Rod Sims, the chair of Australia's Competition Authority, notes that the platform's gatekeeper role was underscored by Facebook's decision to, quote, block large swaths of Australian content, including news, during their negotiations with our government regarding Australia's bargaining code, end quote. Similarly, the United Kingdom's Competition and Markets Authority concluded after its own inquiry that insufficient competition in digital advertising undermines the ability of newspapers and others to produce valuable content to the detriment of broader society, which, quote, can lead to wider social, political, and cultural harm through the decline of authoritative and reliable news media, the resultant spread of fake news, and the decline of the local press, which is often a significant force in sustaining communities, end quote. With that in mind, today's hearing is an opportunity to examine solutions to this urgent problem. Earlier this week, I reintroduced the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act with Ranking Member Buck. Our legislation would give news publishers an even playing field to collectively negotiate with dominant platforms to improve the quality, accuracy, attribution, and functioning of news online. As part of today's hearing, I look forward to discussing recommendations to strengthen and improve this legislation. In particular, I'm eager for a discussion on ensuring that this framework will provide for good faith negotiations by all parties and mechanisms to ensure that each and every hardworking journalist benefits from these negotiations. While I do not view this legislation as a substitute for more meaningful competition online, including structural remedies to address the underlying problem in the market, it's clear that we must do something in the short term to save trustworthy journalism before it's lost forever. This bill is a life support measure, not the answer for ensuring the long-term health of the news industry. We need an all-of-the-above approach to save journalism and to take on monopoly power. Doing nothing is not an option. In that vein, I'm also eager to hear other suggestions to rein in the power of these monopolies. At our last hearing, we heard bipartisan agreement from the members of our subcommittee on a number of issues, our structural separation, preventing self-preferencing and discrimination, and interoperability and data portability requirements. Congressional inaction and insufficient enforcement levels have led to waves of consolidation and layoffs by reporters at both digital and print publishers alike. In the absence of a competitive marketplace or congressional action, there will continue to be mass consolidation and widespread layoffs. As the events leading up to the violent mob's attack on the Capitol on January 6th have made clear, the stakes are high. Our country will not survive if we do not operate with a shared set of facts, if corruption is not exposed and rooted out at all levels of government, and if power is not held to account. As Justice Louis Brandeis wrote in 1927, those who won our independence believe that public discussion is a political duty, that the greatest threat to freedom is an uninformed citizenry, and that the freedom of thought and speech are indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth. This is the very reason the press is called the Fourth Estate. Whether it's an online publisher, a national newspaper, or a local broadcaster, we cannot have a democracy without a free and diverse press. In closing, I look forward to today's hearing and learning more from our very distinguished panel of witnesses. I now recognize the distinguished gentleman from Colorado, the ranking member of this subcommittee, Mr. Buck, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am pleased to co-sponsor this important legislation with you, and I thank you for your collegiality and focus on bipartisanship. In the 1990s, 4% of the world's population used the internet. Today, that number is nearly 60%. The internet is a tool with incredible opportunities for expanding freedom and democracy in America and around the world. But we need to confront the reality that multinational corporations are sabotaging Americans' access to information and advancing authoritarian regimes' efforts to manipulate the internet for oppression. When the internet was first developed, its potential as a bastion of democracy was easily recognized. President Reagan famously said, "Technology will make it increasingly difficult for the state to control the information its people receive. The Goliath of totalitarianism will be brought down by the David of the microchip." We are now seeing big tech making content-related decisions for people around the world, including here in the United States. What content is available to a free citizenry is driven and shaped by the political agendas of these tech corporations, not consumer preferences. We're not seeing a systemic problem with people shutting themselves out of the public discourse as critics feared. Instead, the tech titans censoring material they disagree with. And they're able to do this because they have achieved monopoly status in the market. Their monopoly has given them the power to police the marketplace of ideas and dictate what consumers can see. This problem is exacerbated by small and medium market news sources disappearing because monopolies are squeezing them out of the market. Companies like Google and Facebook have decimated small and medium market news sources by cutting their ad revenues. In 2010, Google publicly disclosed how much of the ad revenue they shared with publishers. At the time, publishers were earning almost 70% of the revenue from content ads, which are the ads you see on a publisher's website. In 2020, the Association of National Advertisers estimated that publishers are now only taking home between 30 and 40% of the ad revenue. That's a huge decrease, and we have seen the adverse effects of that change. Since 2004, the United States has lost approximately 2,100 newspapers, which accounts for a quarter of the nation's total. In 2004, there were almost 9,000 newspapers, but by the end of 2019, that number dropped to 6,700. More than 200 of the nation's 3,143 counties and parishes no longer have a local paper. And the newsrooms that are closing are mostly in small rural communities. Similarly, local radio and TV stations are also disappearing at an alarming rate. Study after study shows that Americans are more trusting of local news outlets and local reporters, and with good reason. There is more diversity of viewpoint in the small and medium market outlets. That diversity allows space for more voices, and it benefits our democracy. My concerns about the decline in local news outlets are not based on some nostalgia for a former era. The robust exchange of ideas has always been important in this country, but it is now essential as conservatives seek to battle cancel culture and maintain a voice in the public square. Many of my colleagues advocate doing nothing in this area because we should just let the market work. From this perspective, newspapers and local TV and radio stations dying is just the result of competition in a healthy marketplace. They lean on the idea of creative destruction and Darwinian competition. I value the market, economic freedom, and capitalism, but I also value freedom of speech and freedom of the press. I want to see these bedrock American values preserved for future generations. We are seeing the failures of antitrust policy at work with big tech. Big tech not only controls the news market because it controls the digital advertising market, it also exercises gatekeeper control over speech. All Americans should be concerned. We are just starting to see the results of tech titan control over the news and how it does not bode well for future generations. Congress sat idly by as these platforms became monopolies. We cannot sit by and let them become the public square, too. We cannot let them become the arbiters of truth and the wielders of government-like power. These companies track and seek to run our lives through their technologies and algorithms. Big tech companies have become digital kings, and they represent precisely the kind of political power the antitrust laws are designed to tackle. This bill is a step in the right direction to dethroning those digital kings. It will give publishers and broadcasters a 4-year exemption from the antitrust laws so they can more effectively bargain with Google and Facebook. It is not a subsidy for outlets, but rather a leveling of the playing field in favor of democracy and free expression. Mr. Chairman, I also want to make sure that through this legislation, we are not creating unintended consequences that will end up harming those we seek to help. For example, we want to make sure that news outlets involved in negotiations are not incentivized to harm the interests of competitor news groups not at the table. Likewise, we want to ensure that Google is not harming those it hasn't negotiated with by burying them several pages back in search results. I am pleased that this bill gives small-town outlets like the Greeley Tribune and the Fort Morgan Times and conservative outlets like Breitbart and The Federalist a chance to negotiate together and claw back some of their hard-earned advertising dollars from Google and Facebook. Advertising dollars are the lifeblood of these outlets, earned through hard work and dedicated reporting. Mr. Chair, I appreciate the opportunity to work together, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today, and I'm going to do something I don't think I've ever done before in an opening statement. I'm going to read from a couple of the individuals. Mr. Travis, Mr. Greenwald I read their full statements last night, very compelling testimony. I'm going to read from part of those because I think they capture what the situation truly is. Let me start with Mr. Travis's written testimony. He says this: algorithms are designed by humans and the results are monitored. Facebook can make any site soar in popularity or crush their traffic, and they can do it in an instant. This is the power of big tech writ large. We are living in a new gilded age where tech billionaires, maybe soon to be trillionaires, have more power than any elected official in the land. Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg, Twitter's Jack Dorsey, Apple's Tim Cook, Alphabet's Sundar Pichai, and Amazon's Jeff Bezos have more power today than Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and Henry Ford ever did in the earliest days of the 20th century. These modern-day tech monopolists can pick presidential election winners, control our national debates, decide whose voice is heard, whose voice is not heard. The Supreme Court no longer decides what the law of the First Amendment is in this great country. These tech executives do. In practice, big tech controls the country, and they control the country by deciding what we see. Well said, Mr. Travis. I mean, if this doesn't underscore why we need to remove the liability protection in Section 230, I don't know what does. Mr. Greenwald makes many of the same points in his written testimony, and then he says this about the specific question at hand at this committee hearing today. He says, how Congress sets out to address Silicon Valley's immense and undemocratic power is a complicated question. Well, it is, posing complex challenges. The proposal to vest media companies with an antitrust exemption in order to allow them to negotiate as a consortium or cartel seeks to rectify a real and serious problem. Very true. But, and this is important, but empowering large media companies could easily end up creating more problems than it solves. He goes on to say this: further empowering this already powerful media industry, which has demonstrated it will use its force to silence competitors under the guise of, quote, quality control, runs the real risk of transferring the abusive monopoly power from Silicon Valley to corporate media companies. And this last clause is important. Or even worse, encouraging some sort of de facto merger in which these two industries pool their power to the mutual benefit of each. We already saw that happen. We saw it in last fall's election. Both Mr. Travis and Mr. Greenwald cite this in their written testimony. Last fall, when big media teamed up with big tech to make sure the American people didn't hear about the Hunter Biden story in the weeks leading up to a presidential election. So we've already seen them team up against we the people. And now we have legislation that's going to give big media this consortium and cartel power. At the same time, we're looking to use antitrust law to deal with big tech. We're going to give an antitrust exemption to big media. Maybe that's the right course, but I got real questions about that, whether we should move in that direction. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. I want to thank them again for coming, particularly Mr. Travis, who traveled here in person. I appreciate his good work, and we look forward to a chance to hear from each of our witnesses, Mr. Chairman. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's witnesses. Our first witness is David Shavern, the president and CEO of the News Media Alliance, where he has served since 2015. Mr. Shavern spent 10 years at the United States Chamber of Commerce in a number of executive roles, including executive vice president, chief operating officer, and chief of staff. He's a member of the board of directors of Transamerica Insurance and serves on the board of trustees at the University of Pittsburgh. Mr. Shavern received his Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Pittsburgh, his MBA from Georgetown University, and his JD from Villanova University School of Law. I would now like to recognize my distinguished colleague and the vice chair of this subcommittee, Ms. Jayapal, to introduce our second witness, and I know she does so with incredible pride. Ms. Jayapal, you're recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this opportunity to welcome Mr. Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft and a fellow Washingtonian who has done a tremendous amount for our region, our state, and indeed our country. Mr. Smith is one of the leading global figures in the technology industry today, and he's testified several times before the United States Congress and other governments on policy issues. He joined Microsoft in 1993, spending 3 years leading the legal and corporate affairs team in Europe. In 2002, he was named Microsoft's general counsel and led the company's work to resolve antitrust controversies with governments around the world and companies across the tech sector. I believe that's given him a very unique and valuable perspective on the issues of tech and antitrust and the responsibility of the tech industry to work with government on smart regulation that protects competition, innovation, and democracy. And Mr. Chairman, I actually believe that that experience is very much part of the reason that Microsoft played such a productive role in Australia most recently, and I know we're going to hear about that more today. Before joining Microsoft, Mr. Smith worked as an associate and then partner at the law firm Covington and Burling. He earned his BA from Princeton University, his JD from Columbia University Law School, and studied international law and economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, Switzerland. Mr. Smith, I thank you for joining us, but also for the tremendous work you do in our state and in our country. I look forward to your testimony today.
I thank the gentlelady, and I also want to thank Mr. Smith for his assistance during the course of our investigation. He provided a very valuable briefing to members of the subcommittee during the course of our 16-month investigation, and again, thank you for that. Our third witness is Jonathan Schluss, who is the president of the News Guild Communications Workers of America, a union that represents more than 20,000 journalists and media workers across the United States and Canada. Before being elected president of CWA, Mr. Schluss was a graphics and data journalist at the Los Angeles Times, where he led their unionization efforts in 2018. This marked the first time in the paper's 135-year history that the newsroom had been organized. Mr. Schluss has also served as the online editor at the Northwest Arkansas Democrat Gazette and as a weekend host for KUAF, a national public radio affiliate based in Fayetteville, Arkansas. He is also an adjunct professor at the USC Annenberg School of Communications and Journalism. Mr. Schluss received his bachelor's degree from the University of Arkansas. Our fourth witness, Emily Barr, is president and CEO of Graham Media Group. As CEO, Ms. Barr has overseen 7 local media hubs, all top 70 markets since 2012. Under her leadership, Graham Media Group was named the 2016 Station Group of the Year by Broadcasting and Cable magazine. Ms. Barr has spent more than 4 decades leading and working in broadcast newsrooms. Before joining GMG, Ms. Barr served as president and general manager at ABC 7 Chicago from 1997 through 2012, and WTVD-TV, an ABC-owned station in Raleigh from 1994 to 1997. Currently, she serves on the boards of both the Associated Press and the Television Bureau of Advertising. It is the chairman for television for the National Association of Broadcasters. Ms. Barr was most recently named 2020's Broadcaster of the Year by Broadcasting and Cable. Ms. Barr received her BA from Carleton College and her master's degree from George Washington University. Our fifth witness, Glenn Greenwald, is a journalist and constitutional lawyer. In 2014, Mr. Greenwald co-founded First Look Media's The Intercept, an online publication where he served as an editor. He left the publication in 2020 and currently operates a popular Substack newsletter. Prior to joining The Intercept, Mr. Greenwald's work was featured by both The Guardian and Salon. He's received a number of awards for his reporting, including the Park Center I.F. Stone Award for Independent Journalism in 2018 and the 2010 Online Journalism Award for his coverage of the abusive detention conditions of Chelsea Manning. The NSA reporting he led for The Guardian was awarded the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. He's written 4 New York Times bestsellers, including No Place to Hide, Edward Snowden, the NSA, and the U.S. Surveillance State. Prior to his writing career, Mr. Greenwald was an active litigator specializing in civil rights and First Amendment cases. Mr. Greenwald received his bachelor's degree from George Washington University and his JD from the New York University School of Law. Today's last witness, Clay Travis, is the founder of Outkick, The Coverage, a popular sports and entertainment website. He's also the host of Outkick, The Coverage on Fox Sports Radio, the Outkick, the show live stream, and Wins and Losses podcast on iHeartRadio. Mr. Travis has also had a number of books, including On Rocky Top, A Front Row Seat to the End of an Era, and Republicans Buy Sneakers Too, How the Left is Ruining Sports with Politics. Before his media career, Mr. Travis was a lawyer working in the U.S. Virgin Islands and Tennessee with a popular personal blog. He ended his legal career in 2006 to focus full-time on writing and entertainment. He has also served as a writer and editor at Deadspin, as well as a national columnist at Fan House. Mr. Travis received his bachelor's degree from George Washington University and his JD from Vanderbilt Law School. We welcome all of our distinguished witnesses, and we thank you for your participation in today's hearing. I will begin by swearing in our witnesses. I ask our witnesses testifying in person to rise, and I ask our witnesses testifying remotely to turn on their audio and make sure that we can see your face and your raised right hand while I administer the oath. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and beliefs, so help you God?
I do.
Let the record show the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you. You may be seated. Please note, again, to all the witnesses that your written statements will be entered into the record in their entirety. And accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time frame, there's a timing light in WebEx. When light switches from green to yellow, you have 1 minute to conclude. When the light turns red, it signals that your 5 minutes have expired. I begin now by recognizing Mr. Shavern for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cicilline, Ranking Member Buck, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to participate in today's hearing. My name is David Shavern, and I'm the president and CEO of the News Media Alliance, a nonprofit trade association representing over 2,000 news organizations across the United States. Our members range from small local newspapers to some of the largest news organizations in the world. The news media is, and always has been, an essential part of our democracy. We are, after all, the only business mentioned in the First Amendment. The core function of news media is to provide robust coverage of global, national, and local issues, from COVID-19 pandemic to corruption by state officials. Their ability to fulfill that role, however, is under threat, and Congress's help is needed to combat that threat. Though journalists' commitment to public interest has remained the same, the way that readers consume news content and advertisers communicate with those consumers has changed dramatically over the years. And as the world has moved online, so has our industry. Our innovations have allowed news media to provide real-time updates on rapidly unfolding stories, such as catastrophic weather events and public health crisis. Local journalism has also acted as a clear antidote to the scourge of misinformation impacting communities across the country. Fundamentally, our readership is at its highest levels ever. But while news organizations continue to invest heavily in generating critically valuable reporting, a few dominant companies in the digital ecosystem ensure that little value is returned to publishers. The government cannot regulate the news business under the First Amendment, but there are now two companies in particular, Google and Facebook, that clearly do regulate us. Their algorithms determine when and if news is seen in search results and news feeds. They determine how news is presented to readers. They collect and control data about our news audiences, and they control the systems and markets around digital advertising. These challenges are born of dominance, and they impact news publishers of every type, no matter the form of ownership or ideological balance of their editorial pages. In thinking about the future of news, too often we get pulled back into debates about past business models. I'm here to ask a question about the future. Do we want professional local journalism to continue to be available to the public, or don't we? Because if we maintain our current path, we will see the ultimate destruction of quality local news for most of the public without any rational expectation of alternatives or new entrants. Hope is not a strategy, nor is it the basis for a sustainable market for news. We need solutions now. So what do we need from Congress? First and foremost, local news publishers need the ability to collectively negotiate with the major platforms as contemplated by the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. In the face of dominant intermediaries, it is unconscionable to prevent publishers from working together to fight for their own future. And the publishers most in need of collective action are local and community publishers who have no individual capacity to assert their value against the major platforms. But experience from around the world has now taught us that this might not be enough. As we've seen in Europe and Australia, when pressed, Google and Facebook will refuse to negotiate, threaten, in some cases actually cut off access to news content, and offer limited compensation to selected publishers in an attempt to forestall legislation. We should all understand that these actions are, in and of themselves, fundamental expressions of market dominance. We would suggest that the Congress consider expansions of the JCPA that would include an oversight mechanism to ensure good faith negotiations by the platforms that would result in equitable treatment for local and community publishers, and that any compensation model reward investments made by publishers in journalists and journalism. Such a system could be structured in a variety of different ways, but fundamentally, it would be a limited and focused response to the challenge of ensuring a future for local journalism. All we're really asking for is a fair chance to fight for ourselves and our futures. Thank you again very much, and I look forward to your questions.
I thank the gentleman for his testimony. The chair now recognizes Mr. Smith for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Cicilline, Ranking Member Buck, other members of the committee. It's a pleasure for me to be here. And let me say as well, thank you, Representative Jayapal, for that kind introduction from a neighboring Washingtonian. Let me first say the obvious. Microsoft is a tech company, and like every business, we have business interests. There are some steps this subcommittee could take that will make us more challenging in our business. It may make it more costly to do business. There are other steps this subcommittee could take that will help us in our business. And yet I have to say what is also obvious is this. The issues before this committee are not about our business or any single business. They are about an issue far bigger than that. They're about the future of journalism in this country. And if one thing is clear, it's this. For almost 250 years, journalism has been a lifeblood of democracy. And this is especially true at the local level. Local news plays critical roles in telling people about what their school board is considering or exposing corruption in public office. But it does a lot more than that, too. It tells an entire community about what's going to happen at the county fair or about the high school band or about a church retreat. I think it's really interesting. Alexis de Tocqueville was one of the first tourists, if you will, to visit America. This was in 1835. And after visiting community after community, he talked about the role that newspapers played in preserving freedom. And then he said this, to suppose that they serve only to protect freedom is to diminish their importance. They maintain civilization. That is true. The news maintains American civilization. But as you noted, Chairman Cicilline, the news in America today is not alive and well. Almost every American knows from an early age that we are a country of 50 states. But we're also a nation of 3,142 counties. And it is at the county level and in cities and towns that communities and people live their lives. And yet after the decline, the collapse of more than 2,000 newspapers, we now live in a nation where almost half of our counties are down to one newspaper at best. 1,540 of those counties, 200 of which have no newspaper at all. And of everything I have read about the state of journalism in America and its impact, nothing is more impactful to me than the statement of a citizen in Florida who talked about what had happened after they had lost their local newspaper. And he said, after several years without a strong local voice, our community does not know itself. How do we maintain civilization? How do we protect democracy if our communities no longer know themselves? That is the issue to be addressed. We all know how this has happened. It's because of technology. Technology that in so many ways, including for my own company, we believe has done so many good things for the country and the world. And yet it's also perfectly clear that what was previously advertising revenue for newspapers has instead moved to advertising revenue for tech companies. And in fact, what we've seen is the decline in advertising revenue for newspapers fall from $48 billion to $14. That is a deep hole that no one has been able to make up. So what do we do? That is the question of the day, and I'll offer three thoughts. First, I think that you all are on the right path. That's why Microsoft is endorsing the Journalism Competition and Protection Act, the JCPA. to give news organizations the ability to negotiate collectively, including with Microsoft, because as presently drafted, we will be subject to its terms. Second, I think it's good to consider additional ideas, including ideas that we've worked with recently firsthand in Australia. Ideas that would impose on tech companies an obligation to bargain in good faith, to avoid retaliation, to be transparent about their practices. These are worthy of competition and consideration by the Antitrust Subcommittee. And finally, I hope that the subcommittee will continue its work to think more broadly about the fundamental lack of competition, especially in search and digital advertising, that are at the heart of not just the decline in journalism, but the decline and challenge in many sectors of the economy. That too is worthy of consideration when it comes to potential new legislation. In short, the issues are big, the needs are urgent, the time is now, and we welcome the opportunity to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. We are really grateful for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Schluss for 5 minutes.
Chairman Cicilline, Ranking Member Buck, and members of the subcommittee, thank you so much for having me today. My name is John Schluss, and I'm president of the News Guild CWA, and I'm here to tell you about the extinction level event workers are facing in the news industry. We're the largest union of journalists in the United States, with thousands of news workers among our membership at large publications like the Washington Post and the New York Times, but also at small ones like the Billings Gazette in Montana and the Jacksonville, Florida Times Union. We're part of the larger union, the Communications Workers of America. I grew up in rural South Arkansas, and I remember as a kid, my grandmother got 2 newspapers every day. In the morning, she got the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, and in the afternoon, she got the Camden News. Fast forward to my first full-time job in the industry, which ended up being at the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette as their online editor. I have a background both in computer programming and in journalism, and I fused my skills to help us transition from printed newspapers to better news online. But 2 months into my job, the head of the company pulled everyone into a room and told us that we were merging with our competing newspaper. Within a couple of months, hundreds of people lost their jobs. I remember seeing reporters, mothers and fathers, crying in offices, not knowing what their futures were going to look like. That was a quick introduction into the radical shift in the news industry. That's been my life, and that's been the life of so many journalists across our country. Cuts, consolidation, and local news sources getting bought out and gutted. At that time, I was told that for every dollar that newspaper brought in, 90 cents of it came from advertising, print advertising. Today, things are radically different. In the last 16 years, 2,100 newsrooms across the country have shut down, and there are half as many newspaper journalists working today as there were a decade ago. That's 36,000 journalists no longer working in cities and towns across the United States, not covering city council meetings, not covering school boards, not providing communities a voice. The pandemic and widespread economic pain across the country has sped up the revenue losses in newsrooms. And 90 cents that newspapers used to earn, that's gone too, as print revenue is dried up and digital advertising is raked in by almost just 2 companies, Google and Facebook. That revenue loss resulting from the platform's dominant market position has left many newsrooms in a weakened financial condition. And that's left them vulnerable to takeover by predatory financial actors who don't care about local news. They only care about cash extraction, and they accomplish that by strip mining local news outlets and cutting local staff. What's left are ghost newspapers or no news coverage at all. And these hedge funds like Alden Global Capital are gutting people off from knowing what's happening in their communities and eroding our democracy. Alden's gobbled up local newspapers and gutted them. Great institutions like the Denver Post and the St. Paul Pioneer Press and the Orange County Register. At 12 publications where we have data, Alden cut staff by more than 75% since 2012, faster than the already devastating industry decline. The Journalism Competition and Preservation Act accurately identifies the problem of excessive market power of Facebook and Google, and we appreciate the bill's focus on rectifying the core power imbalance between those platforms and the news companies. Google and Facebook benefit from the stories produced by journalists, and they use that traffic to sell ads, capturing a majority of the digital ad revenue. The companies should pay their fair share when benefiting from sharing of news stories. However, because many news companies put shareholder profits above our communities, we need specific enforceable requirements to make sure that additional revenue is tied to local news jobs. We recommend that at least 60% of any added revenue generated through collective industry bargaining be dedicated to new jobs. And further, we experienced a wave of unionization in the past 3 years, with thousands of workers organizing to protect their jobs and their publications. Any organization receiving additional revenue must be required to bargain in good faith and remain neutral when workers want to organize a union. We also want to ensure that medium and smaller publications benefit, because the industry is so consolidated. Even just in the past 2 years, 5 companies, several of them controlled by hedge funds, own 1/3 of America's daily newspapers and half of all newspaper circulation. In addition to taking on the tech platform's predatory behavior, we must also address the attacks on local news by vultures like Alden by passing the Stop Wall Street Looting Act. The crisis in local news is a crisis of democracy. Congress needs to use its power to respond to the crisis for the good of our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schluss, and I apologize for the mispronunciation. I won't get that wrong again. I now recognize Ms. Barr for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Cicilline and Ranking Member Buck and members of the subcommittee. My name is Emily Barr, and I'm the president and CEO of Graham Media Group, owner of 7 local television stations. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on behalf of the National Association of Broadcasters and its nearly 7,200 free and local television and radio station members in your hometowns. Broadcasters represent one of the last bastions of truly local, unbiased journalism, information that is still respected by all Americans. Your constituents turn to their local reporters and anchors for voices they trust. Legislative action, including swift passage of the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, is needed to preserve this essential cornerstone of our democracy. This past year challenged us in myriad ways, but among the most painful for many Americans was the isolation they experienced, detachment from their families, neighbors, and communities. When it was needed most, local television and radio stations provided the civic bond for the communities we serve, doing incredible work in the face of our own enormous challenges. We continue to be the primary source of the community-focused information on which your constituents have relied during this pandemic. How do I keep my family safe? When and where can I get vaccinated? When can I visit my grandparents? When can my children safely go back to school? These are the questions that we help our viewers and listeners navigate every day. This past year has also tested our democracy and the very pillars upon which it stands, including a free and diverse press. Due in large part to the misinformation circulating unchecked in the digital ecosystem, more and more Americans have lost faith in the information reaching their eyes and ears. Fortunately, local broadcasters remain a touchstone for the truth and are the most trusted sources of information in the country. I am proud that Graham Media stations exemplify this commitment to community and truth. For example, Floridians who were recently shut out by the state's failed unemployment system did what Americans do when there's no one else to turn to. They called upon their local broadcaster. WKMG in Orlando answered that call, shining a light on that crisis and creating the publicity and pressure needed to put nearly $1 million in unpaid benefits back into the hands of Floridians entitled to them. I've spent over 4 decades in local broadcast television, working in virtually every capacity from the newsroom to the boardroom, and I understand the significant costs of producing quality journalism. But quality journalism, delivered through our uniquely free service, has only been made possible over many decades through advertising revenues. As you all are aware, these revenues have experienced a free fall in recent years, due almost exclusively to the rapid, often anti-competitive expansion of the dominant online platforms. The market power of the tech platforms undermines the online advertising model for local broadcast journalism in 2 important ways. First, the tech platform's role as content gatekeepers stifles our ability to generate user traffic. Second, anti-competitive terms of service and a take-it-or-leave-it approach leave local broadcasters with a below-market sliver of those ad revenues. For local broadcasters and our viewers and listeners, this is a catch-22. To attract online user traffic, we must be accessible through the major platforms. Yet, the terms of access dictated by the platforms devalue our product. Even more concerning is the degree to which certain platforms commoditize news content with little regard for the quality and veracity of the story. This puts fact-based reporting like ours on par with unsubstantiated clickbait as we fight for user eyeballs in both platform news feeds and traditional search. The result is a dangerous focus on catchy headlines and viral stories over quality journalism. This market transformation has been exacerbated by deliberate decisions on the part of the tech platforms to put technological and systemic roadblocks in the way of broadcasters trying to gain access to these platforms. The barriers to entry erected by the major platforms take on many forms. For example, Decisions about which content will be prioritized by algorithms often favor sensationalism and misinformation over hard journalism. Platforms decide unilaterally which content can be monetized and how much revenue they will share. As a result, the dominant online platforms have flourished, siphoning off huge amounts of advertising revenues that are the lifeblood of free local journalism. One significant step toward curing these harms would be the passage of the JCPA. NAB strongly supports this targeted common sense proposal, which would give broadcasters and other news publishers the ability to level the playing field in negotiations with the tech giants. In addition to the JCPA, NAB looks forward to working with Congress to explore additional policy remedies to ensure that journalists and news organizations are fairly compensated for the reporting and content they create, recognizing the inherent value of this original content. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Barr, for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Greenwald for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Cicilline, Ranking Member Buck, members of the committee. Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in these hearings. My name is Glenn Greenwald, and the work I have been doing for the last 25 years, first for a decade or so as a constitutional lawyer, and then for the last 15 years as a journalist, somebody who has done much investigative reporting that has provoked the ire of many governments around the world, who has co-founded a media outlet in 2013 and helped to grow it through 2020 in this very difficult climate. And as a co-founder of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, devoted to defending the rights of journalists to be free of government retaliation, I have a really passionate and deep and long-standing interest in the issues before this committee. I think as well that this subcommittee has done some of the most important work, particularly with the October report, in documenting the serious menace that Silicon Valley monopoly power has, not just for our political life, but for the flow of information and increasingly other sectors of our life. And I certainly agree with everyone who has spoken before me about the serious problem of particularly local news outlets failing as a result of their inability to find a financial model to sustain themselves in this climate. I nonetheless do have concerns about the proposed solution pending before the subcommittee. If you look at the last 5 or 6 months, I believe strongly that the problem of Silicon Valley use of their monopoly power to interfere in and control our political has worsened quite severely. 3 incidents in particular that I define and describe in my opening statement, one being what Congressman Jordan referred to as the censorship of what turned out to be completely accurate reporting based on authentic and genuine documents broken by the New York Post, the nation's oldest newspaper, about the front-running presidential candidate in the weeks leading up to the election, by Twitter simply banning any discussion of that story and locking that newspaper out of its account unless they agreed to delete all references to their own reporting, and Facebook algorithmically suppressing the ability for that story to spread, was an extremely disturbing example of the ability of tech giants to interfere in our elections. The same took place with the removal of the sitting president of the United States, which, although supported by many in the United States, was condemned by world leaders, including many who had a very adversarial relationship with President Trump, Chancellor Merkel in Germany, the president of Mexico, French and EU officials, on the grounds that tech giants are posing a threat not just to American democracy, but to world democracy. The concern that I have is that often we talk about the relationship between journalists and the media industry on the one hand and tech giants on the other as a predator-prey relationship where the tech giants are the predators and the news industry is the prey. But oftentimes that's not the case. If you look at the most serious and disturbing instances of tech censorship over the past 6 to 12 months, one would expect, based on the traditional model of news media, to uphold the values that Chairman Cicilline referred to as a free and diverse press, to condemn and oppose that kind of censorship, and yet the opposite happened. Oftentimes, the journalists were not only supporters of it after the fact, but leading proponents of it beforehand, pressuring these tech companies to censor and to silence ideologies with which they disagree or competitors to these organizations. I'm concerned in particular that by empowering a news media that believes not necessarily any longer in a free and diverse press, but in ideological homogeneity, that they can use this new power to impose these values of censorship, of silencing news outlets with which they disagree in the name of quality control. And I'm particularly worried that we have a news media that is becoming itself increasingly concentrated, where the New York Times is essentially becoming like the Amazon of journalism. This subcommittee issued a report filled with extremely promising and I think important solutions to the problem of monopolistic power. And I'm concerned that if the subcommittee instead starts taking a piecemeal approach to appease and aggrandize the most powerful industries like journalists, it could forestall the opportunity to get to the root of the problem that is concerning people across the ideological spectrum, which is the need to apply antitrust laws to these growing monopolies, not in a case-by-case basis, but overall. So I hope the committee stays focused on its outstanding report that it issued. And thanks again for the opportunity.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Travis for 5 minutes.
Chairman Cicilline, members of the subcommittee, I appreciate you having us all here today to talk about an incredibly important subject that impacts all of us, Democrats, Republicans, Independents alike. Nearly 10 years ago, I started my own company, having no idea what direction media was going to move. That company, Outkick.com, is now one of the largest sports and opinion independent websites in the country. We've had a great deal of success. I also host a daily sports talk radio show from 6 to 9 a.m. Eastern, all 50 states, 300 plus AM, FM stations. And on August the 11th, the President of the United States came on my radio program. He came on because he wanted to talk about the need for college football and college sports to be played this fall. Not a particularly partisan issue. We talked about the NBA, we talked about the NFL, we talked about sports as the nation experiences sports. The day after the president came on my radio show, we covered that day, August the 11th, the stories that came out of that interview aggressively, as anyone would who had the president of the United States on their radio show. The day after that interview, Facebook tanked our traffic. The data in the appendixes that we attached for you show that the next day and over the next week, Facebook removed 68% of our audience, 76% of our new users. That cost my company hundreds of thousands of dollars. To me, it was clear content-based speech discrimination. Facebook didn't like that we had the President of the United States on our radio program, and they also didn't like that the majority of the coverage of that interview was positive, which, as a sports fan, it's hard to be negative when the favor of the president is aligned with games actually being played. That, to me, is an interesting anecdote into the overwhelming power that we have given to the big tech companies in this country. It doesn't stop there either. There's an interesting thing that happened to us just in the last couple of weeks. Some of you may have read an editorial in the Wall Street Journal by a man named Dr. Macri, who is a Johns Hopkins doctor, highly qualified. His opinion, written on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal newspaper, his opinion was that based on the current rate of vaccination, as well as the people who had already been exposed to COVID, it was likely by the end of April that herd immunity would be reached in this country. Certainly some scientists and doctors agree with that. Certainly some scientists and doctors disagree with that opinion. We wrote about that editorial opinion on our website. The article was not in any way complicated or difficult. In fact, our headline was straightforward. Johns Hopkins medical professional, herd immunity will be here by April. We published that on Facebook. Within a matter of days, we received a notification from Facebook with the downright Orwellian subject. Important notification, misinformation violation. Facebook told us that we were not allowed to share the opinion of a doctor on our website because they said it was a fact check inaccuracy. It was, members of the subcommittee, an opinion of a reasoned and well-learned doctor. That is what the scientific method is. We argue about what the truth is in this country with an idea that we reach a better conclusion. Facebook's own fact checkers labeled our article about an opinion to be factually inaccurate, which is an impossibility. Who checks the fact checkers? Our traffic declined by 80%, as you can see, as soon as Facebook found this violation. We would all be rightly concerned if the government of the United States was making these kind of decisions. My concern is all of the big tech companies now have the same power that China has to regulate the internet in its country. Instead of the government doing it, we have allowed big tech to do it. I thank you and look forward to your questions.
I thank the gentleman for his testimony, and now we will proceed under the 5-minute rule. And I'll begin by recognizing Mr. Neguse from Colorado for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also Chairman Nadler for holding this timely hearing to examine legislative proposals to help local journalism and small publishers compete in the digital marketplace. And I want to thank Chairman Cicilline, you in particular, for your leadership in this area. Colorado, which is the state that I represent in Congress, is all too familiar with the decline and closure of local newspaper outlets. The Rocky Mountain News closed a little over 12 years ago. The Rocky, as locals affectionately called it, was a newspaper before Colorado was admitted into the Union. Since then, we witnessed the Denver Post become acquired by a hedge fund, which led to layoffs and cost-cutting measures. In the last 10 years, we've gone from having 2 legacy newspapers with upwards of 500 journalists covering local and national issues to having 1 legacy newspaper with roughly 70 journalists on staff. The reason why these trends are concerning is obvious, and we've heard a compelling case from many of the witnesses today. It's because local journalism and democracy go hand in hand. And simply put, the American experiment cannot work if the voters are not informed on their communities and their leaders. And so with that, I want to thank each of the witnesses for being here and want to thank them for their thoughtful testimony. I want to start with a question that is relevant to my state. As I mentioned, in Colorado, the Denver Post went through with massive layoffs and budget cuts once their parent company was acquired by a hedge fund, Alden Global Capital. One Post reporter mentioned that the Post had, quote, 70 people covering a metro area of about 3 million people. Mr. Schluss, is this situation unique to the Denver Post? And can you provide the committee with more context on how the aggressive squeeze on ad revenues by tech giants really spurs predatory behavior that we've seen from some of these hedge funds to essentially gut local news?
Absolutely. So we've seen, as the shift from revenue for a lot of local newspapers has shifted away from getting a majority of the revenue from print advertising, and less as digital platforms like Google and Facebook take that up. It's allowed large private equity groups like Alden Global Capital swoop in. So it's not just the Denver Post, but other places where we represent members, the East Bay Times in California, the San Jose Mercury News in California, the Monterey Herald, the St. Paul Pioneer Press in Minnesota. The goal for a lot of these hedge funds is to get profits, margins up to a point that's not sustainable. Get them up above 16%, get them up to 20% by getting rid of any assets, selling off the real estate to other companies in their control, cutting staff as much as possible. And right now they're in the process of trying to acquire another large publisher, Tribune Publishing, which has about a dozen newspapers from Chicago to Allentown, Pennsylvania, to Hartford, and to Orlando, Florida. They just want to get profits up as high as possible, and they'll do that by cutting staff and cutting local news coverage.
Thank you, Mr. Schluss. I guess a follow-up question, the logical extension would be, what legislative proposals do you think this committee ought to consider to help mitigate against some of these predatory practices by these companies?
So I think, looking at just even the idea of these takeovers and mergers, right? We're at the point where the industry is super consolidated and under extreme financial pressure by just a handful of actors. So looking at any potential mergers and finding ways to create legislation that would incorporate the idea of how will this affect local news coverage if this merger were to take place? What would it do to the local jobs and the economy? Because when we lose local news outlets across the country, no matter whether they're in blue districts or red districts, taxes go up, corruption goes up, and partisanship goes up as people have fewer and fewer outlets for facts. So that would be one effort. Another thing is provide incentives. Let's get hedge funds out by providing incentives to get them to donate to foundations or nonprofits so that we can have sustainable, community accountable local news.
Thank you, Mr. Schluss. And with that, again, I would say thank you to the chairman and also to the ranking member for their leadership on this important issue, and look forward to partnering with both of them on this front. And with that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back and now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Buck.
I thank the chair for recognizing me, and I'd ask the chair to recognize Mr. Gates, and I will ask questions at the end, if that's okay.
Of course. Mr. Gates is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as usual, your approach to the way our Americans interact with these monopolistic platforms continues to be bipartisan and thoughtful, and I thank you for that. I'm a co-sponsor of the JCPA, but after hearing some of the testimony, I'm wondering whether I should be. Not every failure of every local news entity is a failure of democracy. Sometimes it's just bad news. Sometimes the people who work in local journalism are the ones creating, as what Ms. Graham described, unsubstantiated clickbait. And so we cannot view it that way. Mr. Greenwald, I have some questions for you, and I'll confess at the beginning, though you once said I have, quote, the worst ideology in Congress, I am a ravenous consumer of your content. I find it all very thought-provoking. And I read you on Substack frequently. But I want to go into one of the elements of your testimony where you talked about the potential for the JCPA to create a stratification within media, where you create more distance between the large media conglomerates like Gannett or News Corp, and then maybe those smaller, more independent sites that are also creating good news. Are you worried that by trying to remedy the monopolies in big tech, we create greater challenges in the monopolies of big media and make it even harder for independent, gritty journalism to survive?
I do worry about that quite a bit, Congressman Gates. We've listened to many people speak quite accurately about the state of the news industry today, and what we're hearing is not a kind of idealized or romanticized picture that we might like to think about of having a diverse and dispersed power throughout the industry where lots of different voices can be heard, but instead a very concentrated industry, very similar, in fact, to Silicon Valley, maybe a few steps behind it, such that if you empower this industry without including enormous numbers of very clear and concrete safeguards to prevent it, you could very well be essentially accelerating some of the worst industry trends, ensuring that, say, hedge funds who control the industries or media giants that exert overwhelming power like the New York Times or digital outlets can further entrench their power through this negotiating force that becomes an antitrust exemption in a way that I'm concerned will exacerbate the problems that the subcommittee is correctly identifying as a problem, but also forestall the longer term solutions of dealing with Silicon Valley monopolistic power that is at the root of all of these problems.
Yeah, and in that regard, you seem to agree with the fundamental premise laid out by Chairman Cicilline and Ranking Member Buck. I mean, you are one of the founders of The Intercept. As a result of The Intercept not liking some of your criticism of the political left, you had to leave the entity you co-founded. You go to Substack to write, and now even at Substack, there are efforts underway to cancel and censor journalists who are critical of other journalists. And so if the remedy that Mr. Cicilline and Mr. Buck have proposed is not the right one, what insight would you offer in order to get at the core problem?
The concern I have is that the discussion in the legislation seems grounded in a premise that the only or the primary problem of both local and national journalism is that Google and Facebook are vacuuming up advertising revenue, and if that you simply fix that problem, the problem of media failure will be rectified as well. And I don't think that's true. I think there's reasons why consumers have turned away from journalism. I'm concerned that legislation like this can prevent the self-examination of why journalism has failed so many people, why people no longer trust it and put their faith in it. And I do absolutely believe that the problem of Silicon Valley monopolistic power and its ability to interfere in our politics and to impede a free press is a very serious one. But oftentimes it's the media itself, it's journalists themselves who are demanding that that power be exercised in a censorious way that undermines a free and diverse press. And that's why I think that until the problem that this subcommittee identified in that report is addressed head on, which is breaking up the monopoly powers of this industry, none of these problems will really be fixed. And oftentimes these piecemeal solutions can make them much worse by empowering an industry that's causing many of them in the first place.
Thank you for that thoughtful feedback. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I'll submit my additional questions to the witnesses for the record, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gazvia. I just want to make a quick point here, if it's okay. I do think that people should understand that consumers have not turned away from journalism. They're consuming it at a higher rate than ever before. And the bill that at least Mr. Buck and I have put forth, as well as a number of colleagues on the subcommittee, provides a temporary fix for a 48-month period. And in fact, anything these larger media companies would negotiate would be available to the smallest rural newspaper in any city and town in America, which I think protects against some of the concerns that Mr. Greenwald mentioned. So I think we've thought about that, and I think the bill responds to that. And finally, I'd just say that with respect to the larger challenges of antitrust and monopolization, the committee intends to be very active on all of the solutions contained in our report. We're not going to do either or, we're going to do both. So I just want to reassure the witnesses of that. And with that, I recognize the distinguished gentleman from the state of New York, Mr. Jones, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also the ranking member for your bipartisan leadership on this issue. And of course, thanks to all of our witnesses for your testimony this morning. I'm glad we have a bill before us, as I alluded to, with such strong bipartisan support. Since today's hearing is about saving free and diverse press, I want to center a topic we haven't heard enough about thus far, and that is the importance of journalism by and for communities of color. As the advertising market consolidates, we need to stand up for the media serving communities of color. In my district, that means publications like Black Westchester. A.J. Woodson founded Black Westchester with a mission, and that mission is providing a platform for Westchester County's communities of color. That's especially important in Westchester County, which has a long history of housing discrimination and remains under a federal consent decree to desegregate its neighborhoods. In Westchester, the mortality rate for the county's Black infants is 4 times higher than for white infants. And police arrest 15 times more Black people for cannabis possession than white people, even though Black people and white people use the drug. All too often, Westchester officials and large media organizations weren't reaching communities of color or listening to them. Today, Black Westchester helps bridge that gap. That's why Black Westchester has always been available online for free. If they put up a paywall, they'd exclude the very people they're working to serve. So to fulfill their mission, they depend on advertising. But lately, that ad revenue is harder and harder to come by. And the challenging financial conditions Black Westchester is confronting are typical of the conditions that similar publications are confronting throughout the country. Now, this committee's 2020 majority staff report is clear. Facebook and Google wield monopoly power over digital advertising, and as a result, over the freedom and diversity of the press and the future of our democracy. 2 big tech companies shouldn't have the power to decide whether and how Black voices or the voices of any other marginalized communities are heard. That power should belong to us. Mr. Woodson put the problem perfectly. Quote, independent, free, and diverse press like us how do we survive? So, Mr. Schluss, since you mentioned this issue in your written testimony, let me ask you, how will the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act help local publications by and for people of color and other marginalized communities?
So I think, the recommendation that I put forward that we actually make sure that we're targeting as much as we can to jobs would help go in that direction. I mean, this is a huge problem that we have, and one of the major issues that folks organize unions around, because their newsrooms actually don't even look like the communities that they serve, right? The demographics are way out of whack. So I think too, one of the things that Congress needs to focus on is making sure that there are ways for nonprofit or foundation support for communities of color to make sure that we actually cover and support those voices, because it goes back to whether you have a publication in a big city or not in a small town. It's a question of making sure that there's accountability there, that it looks like the community, and that it's actually giving that community a voice regardless of race or ethnicity.
Thanks. And Mr. Chavern, finally, if the fundamental problem of Facebook and Google are their monopoly power, shouldn't all options be on the table, including breaking them up?
Oh, certainly. I mean, we've been supportive of certainly the committee's work on antitrust and the judicial actions on antitrust. But a couple of things, those antitrust actions take a very long time, right? Many of these antitrust trials won't start for years. We have an immediate problem. And to your earlier question, the ones most in need of collective action are small and community publishers, including most particularly publishers of color, who are suffering deeply in this broken marketplace for real quality journalism. I mean, this is a product that is critically important to communities. It's more popular than ever, but the system itself isn't rewarding it. And that's not just a question of where the ad dollars go. That's a question of dominance from two tech companies. So if we want diverse voices of every perspective, we need a market for news content that works and that sustains new entrants and diverse voices. And we don't have that now. This is most particularly a problem for small and community publishers of every type.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. I think it gives us an opportunity to look at what is clear a pervasive problem. I have not signed on to this particular solution, and I have a lot of questions. Probably the most notable question is, why is this not a joint hearing with the Intellectual Property and Courts Subcommittee, since clearly what we're talking about is negotiating over one organization's statutory intellectual property and finding a solution. But nevertheless, I'd like to talk primarily to the two witnesses who are here in person. Mr. Greenwald, I'm going to try to make this rapid. Mr. Travis, I'm sorry. Mr. Travis.
Been confused for worse, trust me.
Yeah. Mr. Travis, thank you. Have you ever read Atlas Shrugged or Fountainhead?
A long time ago, yes, sir.
Mr. Smith, I assume you have too.
Parts of it a long time ago, yeah.
Okay. Well, when I was listening to the witnesses, I heard, quite frankly, exactly that. Rather than the courts deciding an antitrust problem and solution, I heard government saying, and in the case of, I think both Graham Media and the News Guild, what they were saying was that we need to take an industry that is losing, and we need to give them money from an industry that is winning in order to preserve that industry that is going away. Notwithstanding whether that's right or wrong, did anyone hear anything differently here?
Well, what I would say is, while there may be an element of that, I think there are two dimensions that change the normal situation. Number one, we're talking about an industry that is suffering because of changes in competition that rightly can and should be addressed through antitrust law. And number two, we're not talking about just any industry under the sun.
And Mr. Smith, I appreciate that. But, one of my challenges is, in fact, that all the way back with Ayn Rand, we were taught a lesson, which is that when government starts to pick winners and losers, there's no end in sight. And that's one of my concerns here is are we picking winners and losers? And I think we clearly are. Now, there's no question at all that these companies own their intellectual property, and in fact, we may want to give them additional rights to protect that property. And Mr. Smith, I'll pose a question to you. Currently, if Google searches your copyrights and makes that available, do you have any objection? Do you need to monetize any and all of your copyrighted material that they go through and create searches for? I'm talking about Microsoft's own copyrighted material.
We may not have objections with respect to the monetization or lack thereof for our content, but look, we're not in the news business. So I don't think that what is true for us actually is all that relevant.
Well, and let's go through the news for a moment, and we'll stick to news for a moment. In 1982, and I'll go to Mr. Greenwald. In 1982, the Cleveland Press went out of business, and Cleveland went from 2 daily newspapers to 1. Was that because of the internet, as far as you know?
No, the internet did not exist in 1982.
In fact, were newspapers diminishing and consolidating throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s rather than expanding, particularly the classic daily citywide newspaper?
I think to a large extent that is true. I think when you look, and the broader question that you're asking is, I think, a good one. Can you create and fix antitrust violations, which I think are existing from big tech companies now, by creating an antitrust exemption for others? This is such a complex issue that seems to me to be a really, I understand the intent, and I think the intent is a good one, but the challenge of correcting antitrust power by creating antitrust exemptions seems to me to be an inherent difficulty.
And I very much agree, and I'm not trying to disagree with the problem, just question some of the solution. Let me just ask a question for anyone that wants to with the remaining few minutes. The New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post, have any of those organizations ever put things out in print that were untrue or chose not to print things which were true?
Yes.
Okay, so if they do it, then we're really not talking about a difference in the case of Facebook or Google or any of the others. What we're talking about is who did it in the 18th and 19th century with impunity and who may be doing it today because of its market power. Is that true?
The gentleman, the time of the gentleman has expired, but if a witness wants to answer quickly, you may do so, if you understand the question.
We're not talking about when or who did it. We're talking about what laws apply to it. That's what I would say this is about.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Deutsch of Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, toward the end of his life, legendary journalist and America's most trusted name in news, Walter Cronkite, said, "I think it is absolutely essential in a democracy to have competition in the media, a lot of competition, and we seem to be moving away from that." Over a decade since his death, we can agree that his warning was an extreme understatement. The harm that anti-competitive practices of technology platforms like Facebook and Google sometimes feel very abstract, but the value of a free and diverse press, especially local news media, has a very tangible impact on our lives and on our communities. Local investigative journalism can root out corruption, bring attention to issues that matter in our communities, but that don't and will never attract national attention. In the 3 years since the shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, we saw the story fade from national headlines, but local outlets like the South Florida Sun-Sentinel were exhaustively investigating the failures that contributed to that awful day, important work that was recognized with the Pulitzer Prize. And our community has worked in our shared grief to keep alive the memory of the 17 we lost that day, their hobbies, their passions, their character. And it's the work of the Sun-Sentinel and the Palm Beach Post, the Miami Herald, the local broadcasters, other local news media that's been an important part of telling these stories and demanding accountability. On the other hand, Facebook, Google, other technology platforms played an instrumental role in spreading misinformation and conspiracy theories about the tragic event that day and many others. And I've asked Google and Facebook and Twitter in hearings before the Judiciary Committee why they keep giving not just a platform, but a megaphone to people who spread lies about the shooting in my district to people who target children, survivors, and their families. And we need more responsible, high quality journalism and fewer monetized megaphones that some use to attempt to destroy lives. Mr. Shavern, how do we rebalance the scale? What are the main components of making online platforms take more responsibility for the content they carry and of leveling the playing field between news publishers and online platforms so that high quality content gets elevated over conspiracies and misinformation?
Great. Thank you very much, Congressman. Two things. I agree with you, by the way. We want competition in the news media, but we currently have a market that suppresses it. It makes it impossible to develop new entrants and competitive voices, new diverse voices. If you were going to build a new entrant in local news, you're facing a marketplace dominated by two companies that suppresses the value of that content, makes it impossible to have new entrants. Secondly, specifically to your point, I have talked in other contexts about the role that Section 230 plays in the ecosystem, and in particular, the platform's role in amplifying content, the choices the platforms make to decide what gets seen and what doesn't get seen. Too often, I think the discussion is about whether a particular piece of content should be labeled or moderated or taken down. And that avoids the question about what the platforms do, the choices they make, and the responsibilities they should have about the choices they make. So I would say two things. One, we need a fair capacity for news publishers to improve the market for quality news content. And we have to look at the responsibilities that the platform should have for their decisions about amplifying content.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Shavern. Ms. Barr, I mentioned the harm to communities and the harm to individuals who are the targets of lies, but your testimony raised a good point about the damage posed to responsible news outlets with the placement of responsible journalism alongside these kinds of lies. Can you just elaborate on the challenges that it poses to your business?
Yes, thank you very much, Congressman. Look, what happens is we put our stories online, and I can tell you that roughly 60 to 70% of what we put out there is referred back to us either by Google or Facebook. So when those stories sit online adjacent to stories that might be misinformation or outright lies, clickbait, whatever you might want to call it, it literally diminishes our reputation and makes people distrust or causes some distrust. So we then spend a lot of time trying to ensure that our viewers and our users understand that we've researched, we have trained journalists, we know what it is we're trying to say, and we have to also then go back and look at the stories that are incorrect and make sure they understand that those aren't believable. But it's really difficult because, as we all know, a lie goes around the world very quickly.
Thanks, Ms. Barr. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this important hearing. And thanks to all of the witnesses. The testimony of every one of you is really helpful and instructive. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Bentz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for this most interesting meeting. This first question is for Mr. Greenwald. It's been said about the Newspaper Preservation Act passed back in 1970 that it was removing those so protected from the judgment of the marketplace. It's also been said that it failed to prevent abusive tactics, failed to help the smaller papers, did little to improve the quality of the opinions and writings of newspapers. Can you share with me the difference between that act, the Newspaper Preservation Act, and the bill that we're discussing today?
Well, I think that this goes to the comment that Chairman Cicilline made after the last time I spoke about how more and more people are consuming news than ever before. And I think that if you ask people inside the news industry, virtually everybody will acknowledge that the reason for that is because of what was essentially a sugar high of the last 4 years being one of the most polarized eras in American history because of the person who was occupying the Oval Office being so controversial. And that prior to that, there was a significant decline in the number of people who were trusting and consuming news content. Ratings were collapsing, local papers were losing subscriptions, people were talking about the New York Times going out of business. And there was a kind of temporary event that intervened to save the news industry. Then that sugar high is now gone. And if you look at data, there's no question that more and more people, more than ever before, distrust the media precisely because so much of the disinformation, conspiracy theories, and falsehoods come not from newly created sites online, but from the very industry that this bill would essentially empower by enabling them to act as a consortium.
Thank you. I'm not sure I heard an answer to my question there, but I'm going to go to Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, it's been reported in the press that you were personally involved in the discussions with the officials in Australia, including the Prime Minister. What were your takeaways from your involvement, and that you think might be most relevant to the issues we're discussing today?
Well, thank you. I actually think that there's some important takeaways from Australia that are very relevant to the conversation taking place. And I'd actually go back to what Mr. Issa asked, is this about picking winners and losers? And I would say, no, it is not. Basically, Australia was addressing an issue similar to the United States. The reason that publishers cannot negotiate collectively is because of laws passed by Congress, the Clayton Act and the Fair Trade Commission Act. And so what Australia did was give the publishers the ability to negotiate collectively. And so that's what this Congress would do. It would, Mr. Issa, going back to your point, by passing the JCPA, not pick somebody new, but address the unintended consequences of what Congress did in the past when it crafted antitrust laws that got in the way of these collective negotiations. Now, the other thing that I think is very interesting and relevant from Australia is this. What we're finding is that the big publishers are not interested in negotiating collectively. The three largest news organizations in Australia are all negotiating separately. It is the small publishers that are negotiating collectively. And I basically believe that if this Congress passed the JCPA, you'd have 4 years to test the situation, but in all probability, that's what you would find here as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Issa.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on exactly what you said. Let's presume for a moment that we like this bill and we were going to pass it. Is there any reason that you wouldn't limit the collectives to companies that would be under a certain amount of size? In other words, limit it to those who inherently have limited market power, because here the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and others probably would turn away and say, no, we've got that handled.
If that is an issue that concerns you, I think that there are two alternatives to address it. One is to pass the bill as drafted, and you have 4 years, and then it expires or you renew it. The other is craft some exception so that it only applies to, say, a publication below a certain revenue threshold. You know, either way, I think you are accomplishing what I believe is your fundamental goal, which is to enable the small publications of the country to be able to negotiate collectively.
Well, you know, there's no smaller business in most cases than a recording artist. So let me ask one quick question.
The time of the gentleman
I would
has
love to have,
expired.
but we'll to be
Maybe
continued.
someone else can yield their time, but
Thank you,
the time
Mr.
of the gentleman
Chairman.
has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, for 5 minutes.
I thank the distinguished chair for yielding as well as for your leadership on this issue, along with the distinguished gentleman from Colorado, the ranking member. Justice Brandeis once observed that in America, we can have democracy or we can have wealth concentrated in the hands of the very few, but we can't have both. I think it would be fair to say that it also seems to me to be the case that in America, we can have democracy or we can have the emasculation of the free and fair press, particularly at the local level, but we can't have both. And as the framers crafted this republic, and clearly it's not a perfect union, we're on the march toward a more perfect union. They never promised a perfect country. They were imperfect themselves, but they clearly understood the connectivity between the free and fair press, our democracy, liberty, and the republic that they were building. There's a reason why the freedom of the press is in the First Amendment, not the 5th, the 10th, the 15th, the 20th, and thereafter. And so I appreciate this hearing and the importance of it to our democracy. It seems to me to be an existential question. Ms. Barr, you testified that the market power of the tech platforms undermines the online advertising model for local broadcast journalism. Can you elaborate on that particular point? Because I think what's being said is not that technology has changed and you no longer can receive revenue from the traditional print publications. It's that even in the context of shifting to the digital platform, the current construct undermines your ability to secure advertising revenue. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, thank you, Congressman Jeffries. So what I meant by that is that in the current situation, a lot of our viewership, which used to be on television, on linear television, has shifted to usership, if you will, online. And in so doing, we've seen our ratings on TV go down. And while we do have more people accessing us online, the value of the advertising that we receive back online is a fraction of what we've lost on the television side. So we're spending considerably more money to produce and support what goes online. It's not just taking the 6 o'clock news and putting it online. We're literally creating new content for online, but we're doing it at great cost without being able to return the same kind of revenue. So as a result, we're just spending more to get less.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I appreciate your testimony and the support of Microsoft for this legislation. As I understand it, this could, in some ways, impact your business model, perhaps in a somewhat adverse fashion. And so I'm interested, Mr. Smith, in your assessment as to why the company has taken this position, why you think ultimately it's a good thing for the country, democracy, and perhaps even the free and fair flow of commerce.
Well, I think it's clear under the definitions in the legislation as drafted that news organizations would have the right to negotiate collectively with Microsoft because we would be an online content distributor. We meet the threshold of having more than 1 billion users per month for all of our online services and websites put together. We do business with news publishers today. As I mentioned in my written testimony, we have an app, we have a service. We do business with hundreds of publishers. We serve that to millions and millions of people, and we share revenue. If this bill is passed, that means that these news organizations would be able to negotiate collectively with us. I assume that they will negotiate effectively with us. But the reality is, and I said it at the end of my written testimony, what we're talking about here, and I thought your reference to the First Amendment captured it perfectly, is far bigger than us. It is far bigger than technology. It is more important than any of the products that any of us produce today. And let's hope that if a century from now people are not using iPhones or laptops or anything that we have today, journalism itself is still alive and well because our democracy depends on it.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the ranking member of the full Judiciary Committee, Mr. Jordan from Ohio, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would slightly disagree with the statement, Mr. Smith. What our democracy depends on is the First Amendment. Not necessarily journalism is fine, it's all part of it as long as they're actually adhering to the First Amendment. Mr. Travis, at the end of your statement, you said, I'm a First Amendment absolutist and I believe cancel culture intertwined with identity politics is the greatest threat to our country. I could not agree more. Do you have a functioning First Amendment when only one side's allowed to talk? Do you have free speech when big tech, big media, and big government decides what can be said and what can be seen?
No, you don't.
Not at all.
Not at all. And I think that is the major issue that our country is facing today.
Yeah, more important than this broad concept of journalism, which I'm all for, it's the First Amendment, the right to speak and to speak in a political nature and not be censored for speaking out in a political fashion. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Shabern said in his opening statement that this bill would have high-quality professional journalism would be able to form in this consortium and cartel. Is Outkick high-quality journalism?
I would like to think so. Some would disagree.
Who gets to decide? Who defines what's high-quality journalism?
Well, I think that's one of the big challenges, is determining what is and what is not high-quality journalism. Some of the most high-quality journalism that we have seen over the years that has been praised has ended up not being true. Yeah, and that is why we need such a robust First Amendment in general, so that our battles, the marketplace of ideas, is not being artificially constrained, which is what I believe is happening now.
The market's supposed to decide what is and define what is high-quality journalism. The First Amendment decides that, not government. Is that right?
I think that's correct. Yes, sir.
You said something earlier, too. You said, who fact-checks the fact-checkers? Who's supposed to do that?
It's fascinating. In my example, Facebook has flagged 2 different stories at Outkick as disinformation and destroyed our traffic as a result. The first one was linking to the CDC website. We appealed and said, how can you make this determination? The second one, as I said, was pretty straightforward. We linked to a Wall Street Journal editorial from a high-end medical scientist analyzing COVID. Both of those were flagged. We lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue because of Facebook's fact-checking decision. There was no appeals process. They don't even bother responding to us.
But in a general sense, Mr. Travis, isn't it supposed to be the First Amendment that also fact-checks the fact? More speech, right? I mean,
yes.
A number of Democrats have quoted Justice Brandeis. Justice Brandeis said, if there's, quote, misinformation or disinformation out there, the answer is not to squelch that and stop that. The answer is to allow more speech to happen, i.e. the First Amendment, correct?
That is the entire theory of Justice Brandeis's view of the First Amendment, and also the entire basis of the marketplace of ideas.
Mr. Shavern, do you think the London Times thought Thomas Paine was a high-quality journalist?
I'm not sure I could answer that. I'm not trying to respond to that, Mr. Jordan. What I can say is that I represent a vast array of points of view in my membership. Okay. And every one of them has a problem with the marketplace for their content that they invest in greatly. And it's not working.
I'm not saying there's not a problem. I'm all for using antitrust to go after the big tech companies. I'm all for doing 230, something we could do right now. We could repeal 230, take away the liability protection. We could do that right now. If Democrats wanted to do that, we certainly do. We've introduced that legislation. I'm all for doing that. What I'm nervous about is this alliance between big government and big tech that Mr. Greenwald talked about. But I also wanted to go to Mr. Greenwald and talk about this other alliance, which I think is just as frightening, and that's the alliance between big tech and big government. Big tech and big government. In your statement, Mr. Greenwald, near the end of it, you said, a mere 2 months after Parler ascended to the top of the charts, members of Congress demanded that Apple and Google remove Parler from their stores and ban any further downloading of the app. We've seen maybe a better example. Just a couple weeks ago, Mr. Greenwald, we saw 2 Democrats send a letter to AT&T telling them to take certain networks off their, not be a carrier for certain networks. And I just want to read something to get your reaction to this. Because Mr. Travis said earlier, Mr. Greenwald, Mr. Travis said, we would all be rightly concerned if government was censoring speech and not big tech. But frankly, it's both. Big government censoring speech too, because we had 2 members, Democrat members of Congress, write to AT&T, and they said, we want a specific answer to this question. How many of your subscribers tuned into Fox News, Newsmax, One American News, on UVerse, DirecTV, AT&T TV for each of the 4 weeks preceding the November 3rd, 2020 election? Please specify the number of subscribers that tuned into each channel. So basically tell us who your customers are, how many you have, and what they were watching. Mr. Greenwald, do you find that a little creepy and frightening like I do?
The time of the gentleman has expired, but the witness may answer the question briefly.
Very briefly, it goes to the heart of the concern that I have, which is I think there's a huge mismatch between the rhetoric that is being offered to justify this bill and what the bill does. If the concern is the failure of local newspapers, then give them the power to negotiate collectively, but not big media, which is so often embedded in the same problems that this committee is discussing.
The time of the gentleman has expired. He yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Cicilline, thank you. Mr. Buck, thank you for your leadership on this legislation. Mr. Chavern, in the district that I represent, we've lost a ton of local newspapers in Montgomery County, in Frederick County, in Carroll County. I remember when I got to Annapolis as a state senator, there were, I think, 4 reporters from the Washington Post. One covered the state house, one covered the state senate, one covered the executive, and one covered the state courts. Today, they've got 1 reporter trying to cover all of state government. And that creates a serious problem in terms of transparency and integrity and corruption. So this goes right to the heart of why we have a First Amendment in democracy. It's all about self-government and making sure that people understand what government is doing. If we pass this legislation, is there actually a hope of reviving local papers, or are we just trying to arrest the erosion in the numbers of journalistic entities that exist right now?
Oh, absolutely, revive. I mean, what you're seeing is the audience for that product is bigger than ever. The engagement with audiences is intense. Again, you're looking at an industry that has many, many more readers than it ever did in whatever the golden print era was. But the finances are much, much worse. So and the reason why that is the digital intermediaries, Google and Facebook in particular, that stand between us and our audience, take most of that value, and that has to be addressed.
Mr. Chevron, some of our colleagues have been railing about what they call cancel culture. I just made a quick list off the top of my head of some people that right-wing conservatives have tried to censure or cancel privately or publicly, or defund or boycott. Here's some of them. Congresswoman Liz Cheney, who they tried to kick off of her chairmanship of the House Republican Conference. Senator Bill Cassidy from Louisiana, Senator Richard Burr, any of the 17 Republican members of Congress who voted to impeach and convict Donald Trump for inciting violent insurrection against the Union. ABC, Acorn, TV host Samantha Bee, Campbell's Soup, the Dixie Chicks, New York Times reporter Sopan Deb, comedian Kathy Griffin, Guinness, Hallmark, CNN commentator Mark Lamont Hill, Nike, Pepsi, the New York Times, the words climate change and science-based in numerous government agencies and documents, Starbucks, Target, and on and on and on. So do you find that the cancel culture is limited to one side of the political spectrum, or do you think there's a lot of right-wing cancel culture out there which really got this whole, all the engines of censorship revved up?
Congressman, I come at this, again, representing the people creating quality journalism. And the best answers for all of this is to have the most amount of good information, good journalism out there possible. And we currently have a system that devalues that content and constrains our capacity to deliver good information. And the best answer is a diversity of journalism in the system.
Okay. Thank you. And finally, Mr. Smith, it's fascinating that you're here advancing the position you have. First, can you tell us how your quasi-monopoly power today to negotiate with isolated, non-organized media publishers gives you a bargaining advantage? And then if we do pass this legislation, do you think this is a transitory and transitional problem, or do you think it's systemic and structural, and we're going to need to keep something like this going forward indefinitely?
Well, I would focus on two things. First, I would focus, frankly, more on the needs of the smaller publishers. If you're a small news organization, if you're one of these, still 1,500 local county-based publications, I just think it's a lot easier to have somebody negotiate collectively on your behalf. It's a lot easier to have legal counsel work out the terms and conditions. I just think you're going to enable them to pursue the kinds of agreements, whether it's with us or others, more easily and effectively. Will this?
And then there's a provision in the legislation which says that it's got to benefit the entire industry rather than a few publishers, and it's got to be non-discriminatory with respect to other publishers. Isn't that right? Doesn't that take care of some of the problems that some of our colleagues have been raising about how this might entrench a new media establishment?
I think that is helpful, and I think it's important. It's good for you to point it out. I would also just add, in response to your earlier question, I don't think that anybody really thinks that this one thing is a panacea. There's more steps that are going to be needed. I agree with Mr. Greenwald that there are other issues that need to be considered by Congress. And let's face it, this is not a problem that government alone can solve. Journalism will have to continue to evolve, and tech companies like my own are going to have to continue to find new creative ways so that journalism and technology can find some way to flourish together in a way that's not happening yet.
The time of the gentleman has expired. Thank you, Mr. Raskin.
Okay, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize Mr. Stubbe for 5 minutes.
Unanimous consent?
Oh, sure. The gentleman is recognized for unanimous
consent to enter into the record article from last night, Breitbart. Congress wants to give the establishment media a massive handout.
Without objection, the chair now recognizes Mr. Stubbe for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After years of allowing false information about President Trump and the false Russia collusion information that we saw perpetrating across the American sphere, social media platforms then decided to ban legitimate content about Hunter Biden. This is disturbing because it's a reflection of the role these companies wish to play in dominating civic life and public discourse. But at the same time, the Washington Post and New York Times haven't been the best fact checkers. A concern of mine is that in addressing social media's dominance over the news, we will just end up allowing a different set of actors to do the same thing. My questions are for Mr. Travis and for Mr. Greenwald. How can we tackle this issue to create a fair playing field that promotes free speech and does not suppress ideas that are out of favor with elites in this country?
I think it's one of the most fundamental issues of American society today. How do you determine what stories are able to be shared and what stories are able not to be shared? Frankly, I don't consider it partisan at all that when the New York Post has its Twitter account absolutely shut down because of the news story that they are putting out, and all of big tech corresponds in conjunction together, that's the very definition to me of antitrust action. I wrote in my testimony, and I wanted to just hit it. I mean, think about how crazy it is that all of the tech companies in concert, whether you agree or disagree, and I come to this from a completely nonpartisan issue, whether you agree or disagree with what the President of the United States at the time, Donald Trump, was doing on social media, everyone out there should be terrified of how quickly everyone shut him down. Listen to this. In January of this year, Facebook, Twitter, Google, Spotify, Snapchat, Instagram, Shopify, Reddit, Twitch, YouTube, TikTok, and Pinterest all either banned or restricted the democratically elected President of the United States from speaking to the country on their platforms. Right now, Donald Trump may be the focus, but big tech has set the precedent that if they want to shut anyone down, even the most powerful person in all of democracy can be shut down. So how do you regulate the power that big tech has grabbed? I think the question that you're asking is probably the most central and important question that confronts our country today, because Trump will not be the last figure to have this happen to him. That's my concern.
That's a great point you bring out. Mr. Greenwald, do you want to add anything to that?
Just briefly, that there are representatives of my industry, my profession, here with me testifying. And often what we hear is, well, we're professional journalists. We're here to combat disinformation and ensure free and diverse viewpoints that are aired. But so often the reverse is true. If you look, for example, at what happened in that Hunter Biden banning by Twitter and Facebook, the argument that was advanced by those companies to justify it was that the materials reported by the New York Post were, quote, Russian disinformation. That came from news media outlets saying that, and everyone now knows that that is untrue. Even the FBI acknowledges Russia played no role in that, and that the documents were genuine. So often, the most damaging conspiracy theories and disinformation come from the most prestigious news outlets. Obviously, the most destructive case being the claims that were made that led to the country to invade Iraq. And so I think that the concern I have is that if we adopt this narrative that the reason media outlets are failing is only because of Google and Facebook, we allow this industry that needs so much self-examination to essentially be off the hook. And if you allow the biggest players, the New York Times, Jeff Bezos' Washington Post, to be at that table and give them an antitrust exemption, you're essentially creating now two consortiums instead of eliminating the one that's at the root of all the problems.
Well, and I personally believe that until we address Section 230 reforms and liability protection reforms that these companies have, that we're never going to see a change in the behavior, because if we simply just split up the companies, they're still going to act and behave in the manner in which they're acting because they have liability protection to do that. And I would encourage any of my Democratic colleagues on this committee or on the full committee, if you want to work together on that issue, I have a bill, would love to sit down with you and talk to you about it. And my time is almost expired. I yield back, Mr.
Would the gentleman yield?
The gentleman's time has expired. Oh, I'm sorry, yes, 6 seconds.
Okay, if I can have back the 9 of when I said it, I'd be
Well,
thrilled.
he hasn't yielded yet, so the time has now expired.
I thank the gentleman.
I mean, if you have a quick point you want to make, you've had
I just-
2 opportunities to speak. I'm trying to be fair.
I
to the
just
other
wanted
members.
to add on to his question very briefly for Mr. Greenwald. If we have collective negotiations for
No,
small...
Mr. Ice, I'm sorry, I'm not going to let you ask another question. It's 18 minutes beyond the time, so.
Gentlemen, I was just going to ask...
Maybe
whether-
someone will have an opportunity to yield to you. I now recognize the gentlelady from
Chairman,
Washington.
if
Ms.
I could inquire from the chairman.
Yes.
Within your legislation, would bloggers and other people who view themselves as journalists
Mr. Ice,
be
I'm
included
happy to
in
have a
this
conversation with
legislation?
you offline. We have Ms. Jayapal. It's her time. She's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is such an important hearing on the consequences of failing to protect a backbone of our democracy, our free and independent press. In Seattle, we're very fortunate, even though that we've lost many of our newspapers. We do have one of the few remaining family-owned newspapers in the country, and they've taken the leadership in the creation of a new national initiative called Save the Free Press. But even for a larger newspaper like the Seattle Times, the struggle to compete against big tech is serious, from the loss of ad revenue, the forced provisions that tech platforms impose on them, and the co-opting of locally produced news content with little to no compensation by big tech news aggregators. Mr. Smith, you've departed from some of your tech leader colleagues in not only saying that government must play a role in regulating big tech, but then actually holding to that. In fact, I remember during our hearing with the 4 CEOs last year, several of them said that they welcomed government regulation. But let's talk about what just happened in Australia when the government passed a law to require big tech platforms to negotiate with and compensate news platforms for the content they produce. Google decided to play hardball and shut down its operations in Australia. They argued that Australia's news media bargaining code would undermine the open internet. Microsoft, however, supported Australia's news media bargaining code. Can you tell me why and quickly what happened when you voiced your support?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, one of the reasons I suppose I'm here is because we got drawn into the same issue in Australia, and we weren't really part of it until Google told the nation of Australia that if its legislators passed a law that is not entirely dissimilar from this one, it would boycott the entire country. And we looked at the law and we read it and we thought, well, it seems pretty reasonable to us. And so Satya Nadella, our CEO, and I called the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, and we said, look, if Google wants to leave Australia, we'll stay and we'll increase our investment and we'll abide by the law. We'll share revenue with journalists. We're happy to run a search business at a lower margin than Google. And we think that there's some room for all of us to succeed together. And within 24 hours of my going on Australian television to endorse the law, Google called up and said they would reverse course and stay instead. And, look, to be honest, I think that is a challenge we have to look at head on. When companies start threatening countries and saying that if their legislators pass laws they don't like, they'll pull up and leave, then something seems a little out of whack. And I think, trying to restore what has always been the case, which is namely that no one should be above the law, no person, no government, no company, no technology. I think that, that's in part where this started. I think that's in part where this needs to go. And along the way, let's please ensure that journalism can do what it needs to serve all of us.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Shavern, Google argued that the Australia News Media Bargaining Code imposes essentially what's been referred to by some as a link tax. What do you think about that argument?
It was just wrong. There's no link tax in the legislation, and particularly all their rhetoric around breaking the internet was just flat wrong. The fact of the matter is, what it really asked for was a fair deal between news publishers and Google across the whole range of Google products. And really the test is now in terms of how Google is going to address the mass of small publishers in Australia and really use the code. And we're looking forward to seeing that outcome. But no, it wasn't a link tax, and we have nothing here about a link tax at all.
Thank you. Mr. Schluss, in your testimony, you emphasized that mergers between major media companies have eroded news beats across the country, and the power of big tech mirrors a broader crisis of consolidation across news industries and indeed our entire economy. In addition to scrutinizing these mergers, what are other solutions that this committee should consider? And are there other funding models that we should actively be promoting as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the major things, right, is making sure that whatever we do is tying into actual jobs in local journalism, because we've seen that whether companies are just going to be making a bunch of money by pushing profit margins as high as possible, or if they get a blank check from the platforms, we don't necessarily have any accountability or transparency to make sure that they go to jobs. I think more regulation to try to limit hedge funds in this space would be really key, because as folks have said before, one of the ways that we can save the solution and solve it is by providing more competition in the market, by providing more and more local news jobs. I also think that like finding ways to support nonprofit and sustainable organizations is a way about that as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those important comments. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, I see an irony in your testimony in that you're here as a representative of a tech industry that has that through anti-competitive structure and practices is damaging a free press, but you embrace the idea of granting a countervailing license to engage in anti-competitive activity to the media to address that. Isn't the answer to correct the failure of antitrust law vis-a-vis big tech rather than to inculcate anti-competitive behavior in yet another industry?
Well, I would say two things. First, I don't think that thinking about one thing is meant to suggest that one should exclude other things. And most problems require more than one solution, and I don't think this is an exception. But I would just go back to basics. Why did Congress pass the Clayton Act and the FTC Act in the first place? To encourage competition, to protect competition. And there are times, especially when laws are decades or a century or older, that they have unintended consequences. And there is an unintended consequence, and now you can redress this in a very
well. Thank you, Mr. Smith. That's exactly what I'm concerned about. So let me go to Mr. Greenwald and ask you. The chairman said in response to your comments, Mr. Greenwald, that we're going to both attack the anti-competitive practices of big tech and give an antitrust exemption to media content producers. And wouldn't it be preferable only to do that, which will improve the competitive environment and forbear from regulation that might have unintended consequences that would concentrate power or permit anti-competitive activity by particularly big media outlets?
I think it's exactly correct. One of the reasons why I was so excited about the report issued by the subcommittee in October was because it was designed to finally address the problem that is a serious menace for the health of our democracy, which is anti-competitive behavior on the part of one industry. And so to have the solution be to empower another industry that has immense problems of its own and that often works hand in hand with that tech industry, be able to replicate those problems makes little sense to me, especially because the chairman said, and he's right in theory, that, well, if we do this, it doesn't preclude us from then doing this broader agenda. But the political reality is that if you start giving the most powerful industries like the media a reason to stop caring about big tech monopoly because now they have what they want, which is license to do the same thing, you're going to be diluting political support for these broader solutions.
Thanks, sir. Mr. Shavern, quickly, if small and diverse outlets are those that are most in need of protection, why grant an antitrust exemption to the New York Times, Washington Post, MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News?
Well, I fundamentally, the larger outlets already have the capacity and some degree of leverage to get their own deals and arrangements. And again, we saw with News Corp, by the way, people talk about News Corp a lot. News Corp currently has a global deal with Google. This bill is not about News Corp first and foremost. It is, but the whole industry itself, from the largest to the smallest, but particularly the smallest, are in a deeply subservient relationship to two companies that have been allowed to grow and dominate their spaces with a completely hands-off approach from the government for too long. And we need an answer now.
Yeah, I get your point, and I think they're picking out the right answer is what we need to be doing. Mr. Travis, finally to you. Mr. Raskin, his question suggested that sort of criticism and condemnation is the same as cancel culture, and I value robust and unlimited criticism, like North Carolina Republican Party censure of Senator Burr for his impeachment vote, for the revulsion at Kathy Griffin's holding aloft the apparently severed and bloody head of the sitting president. But isn't cancellation something different, where you destroy somebody's career, position, or livelihood in retaliation for a particular view?
Yes, I think it's a well put question. To me, cancel culture is the difference between I disagree with you because, and I disagree with you and you don't have the right to make a living because of your opinion. Cancel culture takes it beyond the debate and goes to actually trying to cut someone out of the debate completely, argue about ideas, argue about decisions. Don't, in my opinion, take the next step and say, and your position invalidates you from being able to be involved in the conversation at all.
Thank you, Mr. Travis. Yield to Mr. Issa.
I thank the gentleman, but I don't think it'll be sufficient for the chairman. I appreciate it. Yield back.
Thanks, sir. Yield my time.
The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Demings, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member as well for this very important, I think, hearing during such a critical time as we discuss these issues. I also want to thank our witnesses for being so thorough and informative this morning. I think we're all in agreement that the way we consume news has changed tremendously through the years. And Mr. Jeffries touched on this a little bit, but with Ms. Barr, but I want to ask this question to Mr. Chevron in a somewhat different way. We know that the majority of Americans now get their news basically through online platforms. And many of the newspapers have made that shift. They have more and more online readership. But could you please talk a little bit about why they still continue to struggle?
Certainly, and thank you for the question. Most of my members, from the smallest to the largest, are primarily digital businesses, and they certainly see their future as delivering news content online to, by the way, bigger audiences than ever. The trouble is they're delivering into an ecosystem that is dominated by two companies. I call Google and Facebook our regulators because they regulate everything about our interaction with our consumers, and they suppress the value of our content, and they make it incredibly hard for there to be not only existing publishers, but if you want to be a new entrant or have a different point of view or represent a different community perspective, it's basically an impossible market in which to build a business, and that has to change.
Thank you. And you've also talked about, or we have heard that collective bargaining efforts really only benefit the largest of countries and or companies and kind of leave the smaller guys out, if you will. Could you talk about how collective bargaining, how can we ensure that collective bargaining efforts would also benefit the independent and smaller organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned this in my my written testimony for the committee. The collective action is primarily benefits those who don't have another way to assert their value, right? It is a primary benefit for small and local publishers to be able to fight for themselves. The larger, as we saw in Australia, by the way, what happened is, as Mr. Smith noted, the larger publishers had some capacity to get their own individual deals. And now the code itself, the code is primarily impacting small and community publishers who are able to band together and have a voice, because without that, they have really no hope.
Thank you so very much. Mr. Schluss, I think it's interesting that we are having this conversation today as I am reading the Kerner report, yet again, trying to understand some of the challenges that we face in our country. I know that News Guild has been critical of consolidation. Could you please explain a little bit how consolidation actually impacts diversity in newsrooms?
Absolutely. So we represent, in your district, the folks at the Orlando Sentinel, and along with them, 16 other newsrooms across the country, just in that one group. Consolidation, when big companies gobble up these smaller local news outlets, whether they're online or in print, what they do is they'll pull out copy desks, they'll pull out design work, and they'll shift that to these like hubs. Those hubs are usually filled with people who don't know, the local names of streets or politicians and can't actually do the editing and the design work. So it reduces the local jobs in the communities by shifting them to these hubs, but it also reduces the local accountability because it removes those kind of voices and those editors who know their communities.
And Mr. Schluss, if you could, I know you mentioned earlier that 2,100 newsrooms across the country have shut down. 36,000 journalists are not working. So as we end on this discussion about diversity, could you also just talk about kind of the impact, who those people are, and why it makes a difference that diversity is considered, but also the impact on the true and balanced and unbiased journalism that we so desperately need in this country?
Right. I mean, one of the kind of really alarming statistics that I think is that with the consolidation, there's also more consolidation of journalists on the coast, right? So 1 in 5 working journalists in this country lives in one of 3 cities, New York, Washington, or Los Angeles. And those communities only represent 13% of all of America's workforce. So we're losing those local voices and we're losing them at an alarming pace that needs to change.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize Ms. Spartz, the gentlelady from Indiana, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since Alexis de Tocqueville was brought up at the beginning of this meeting, I wanted to tell you that as someone who's a big fan of him, and actually his books should be recommended reading in American schools. They were recommended reading in post-Soviet schools when I lived back in Ukraine. It's probably one of the big reasons why I'm in Congress today. I wanted to quote him quickly. He said, "The American Republic will endure until the day Congress discovers that it can't bribe the public with the public's money." I think it's a very valid statement. But go back to the discussion today. I actually add my name to this bill because I believe I would like to have a bipartisan discussion on that issue. And I believe there is still some work to do, but I appreciate Congressman Cicilline and Buck working on this. And I think we had some discussion, what this potential issue could be. Could we actually give more power for collusion from some larger stakeholders in this industry? Or we can have also, more dictatorship of opinion and excuses why some of the people are not, or media is not really well presented on this big search engine. So my questions is, what are the ideas and thoughts you have? And I know maybe we should go further. When I work on the reform on healthcare, we had a lot of issues with employment non-competes provision between hospitals and doctors, and some of the reporters brought up similar issues in media industry. So we also need to look at the proper due process for appeal. We see what happened with Parler and some other conservative applications, or even some other applications that try to get on this platform. So my question is for Mr. Travis, Greenwald, and Smith, if you can quickly just say, what are the things we really should look to make sure that we do not have this piecemeal approach and can create some unintended consequences?
It's a really broad question, and I think it's a really important question as well. To me, what we need to have first and foremost is regulation of the big tech companies. I think Mr. Smith has done a really good job of elucidating that this is not a one-size-fits-all policy, and there isn't any one thing you can do that solves the larger issues in our democracy as it pertains to the power of big tech. What I see, and I can speak to specifically for myself and the company that I run, is there are lots of companies like mine that the difference between making money and losing money is what the algorithm that Facebook chooses to put into play on any given day is. And the consistency of the rules that are being applied in a content-neutral fashion does not exist. And the power there, we have effectively given over, I truly believe this, the right to determine what a First Amendment violation is out of our courts, and we have given them to the big tech companies instead. And that represents a chilling effect. Because I'll tell you this right now, the business side of my company, they said, hey, I don't know necessarily that we want to share internal data and upset Facebook and other tech companies because they have the ability to vice grip, control in many ways businesses. And there are tons of them that are going to watch this clip and they're going to see the data that we shared and they're going to say, hey, that happened to us too. We didn't say anything because we hoped it was just going to go away. So I think it's not a fair fight right now, and the fight needs to be more fair. And to me, ultimately, that's what government's job should be. Create the standards and fair play to allow a fight to be fair in this industry.
Thank you. If you can, Mr. Greenwald and Mr. Smith, add quickly, because I want to yield some time to Congressman Issa too.
Can I just say?
I can just go. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I would just say very quickly, in terms of additional ideas. One, consider the additional measures that should be put into the JCPA, borrowing from parts of the Australian law. Two, focus on the lack of competition in the digital advertising market itself, because that's where most of the advertising revenue and profits are being trapped. Three, think about the conversation before about the needs of communities of color. I think there are a lot of ideas that could be pursued there. And fourth, look, there is this big issue. It's sort of called modernize Section 230. And if we're ever going to get everybody together and thinking about this, we probably have to think through that piece too.
Thank you.
I would just quickly say that I first would encourage the minority members of the committee to really look at that report from October, because I think there are a lot of solutions in it that address the primary concerns that are being expressed. And very quickly, until short of that, of breaking up these companies, I think you could apply First Amendment law or other requirements of content neutral moderation, along with an appeals process based on the reality that these companies are monopolies and people rely on them for their livelihood and for their expression.
I thank the
Thank
gentleman.
you.
The gentlelady's time is
I yield
expired.
back. Okay, see, I don't see my time. Thank
Yes,
you.
I'm sorry. Yeah, your time expired. You actually went over 20 seconds, but happy to accommodate you. I now recognize the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each and every one of you for being here today. I want to start by echoing the comments of so many of my colleagues about the importance of local news. Whether it's print or radio, TV, or online, it's essential that we have journalists, reporters that are focused on what's happening in each of our own very unique communities. And national media is not enough to keep us informed about what's really happening locally. And that's been especially true within the last year. And we need to know about the state of the pandemic in our communities. And we need to know, who in our community is eligible to take a vaccine and how they can get one. And we need to know when it's safe for us to go back to work or safe for us to go to our local gathering places. And so throughout 2020, we needed trustworthy, accurate information about how our election systems were changing so that people could exercise their right to vote safely. Here in Georgia, I represent Georgia, where we had runoff elections, and it was critical to have reporters and news sources who continued to focus on getting accurate information to voters well beyond November. Mr. Barr, your testimony really focuses on the importance of local news, and the investigations that you shared are great examples of the power of local journalism. I just want to start by giving you a brief opportunity to respond if there's anything you feel that you didn't get to fully address.
Thank you very much. I would start by saying the foundation of all journalism starts in local communities. The stories that tend to bubble up into the national papers often have their root in what happens locally. So to give you a very current example, in Houston and San Antonio, where we own television stations, as you all know, we recently dealt with a horrific power grid failure that resulted in people dying, resulted in homes having frozen pipes, people losing lots of money on trying to repair things, and it was quite terrible. It was the role of the local broadcasters in that situation that really helped keep people informed and keep them ultimately safe, because in Texas, it's not common to have a freeze like that. So it was very, very important that we were there, and we were there both on television and obviously online when the power failed and they couldn't reach us otherwise.
Okay, thank you so much for that answer. Mr. Chevron, many newspapers have recently switched to a subscription-based model to compensate for ad revenues. While many people are willing to pay for reliable local news, I'm concerned that a subscription might be considered a luxury in households already making tough financial decisions due to COVID. This in turn could mean that those households get lower quality information as they turn to social media for answers to important questions about the pandemic or exercising their right to vote. How can we make sure that everyone, regardless of their financial situation, has access to reliable quality news?
Great. Thank you for the question. Subscriptions are centrally important to the industry and will continue to be even more important. But there is this component of if you can pay, you get, and if you can't pay, you don't get. And we need a digital ecosystem, social media and other delivery systems that sustainably provide critical information to communities. Because what we have now is we have that ecosystem sucking out that information for free, and that's just not sustainable. We need subscriptions are going to be important for my industry, yes, but we also need to have value coming back from the digital distribution so that we can keep making critical information broadly and widely available.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Chevron, is there a risk that collective bargaining between media companies and the dominant platforms might only help large national media companies and not local ones? And why or why not? And how can we make sure that local newsrooms benefit?
So two things. First of all, again, I think the smallest local publishers are the ones most in need of collective action. But I also have to say, and there's been a lot of discussion about this today, even of my members who are considered big companies, even collectively, compared to the massive market power of these digital platforms, have incredibly unequal bargaining power. This industry itself is critically important to civic society, and it needs the ability to collectively respond to the dominance that's been allowed to build up in the digital ecosystem. So I think there's tremendous particular benefits for small and local publishers, but the whole industry itself needs some capacity to speak for itself.
Well, thank you so much. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, this has been fascinating this morning. I did work in both industries. I owned and actually published a weekly newspaper along with a couple of monthly periodicals. And I worked in radio too at a very small station in Hartford, Wisconsin. So I watched both of the industries change dramatically. And I just wanted to talk about that because if someone would want to comment, I mean, before the revolution of digital, there was the revolution of desktop publishing. And I went through that when we had old serigraph machines and they were doing typesetting. And within, it seemed like a year, there were Macs on everyone's table and the industry had changed overnight. We also, had dark rooms and photographers that it was very labor intensive to get a photo on the front page of the newspaper. It was a big deal. And then all of a sudden that was gone and everything was digital. Shoppers, let me talk about Shoppers for a minute. It was a weekly publication loaded with advertising, a huge supplement for weekly newspapers. And suddenly they either had newspaper content, news content, which changed the dynamic of the industry, or they simply kind of went away. And I know that was another big source of income for them. And on the radio side, I mean, it's been so diverse now between somebody having a choice between XM Sirius, iTunes, so you can pick up any radio station in the entire nation, which you couldn't do before. You were limited to the 2 or 3 that broadcast into your area. Certainly there's other things that have happened in broadcast, and the big one is the explosion of cable news. When I was a kid, you had 4 stations, and if you weren't on one of the networks, that's where you got your news. My whole problem with this, I think, is that the message has been developed into kind of this niche where you find your audience, you target that audience by delivering the content that you think they want to hear. And the reason for that is because you can generate the revenue then. So it's really had a direct effect, I think, on straight news. And I think that's one of our bigger issues right now, which is why there's all these ancillary issues related to what journalists are reporting, is because it's not making any money. And I go back to 230 again. I think that, one of the most important college classes I ever had was called Law of the Press. And in that class, they talked about libel, libel, libel. In any newsroom that I've ever been in, and any editor who is responsible for the content, but always has kind of, it's going to be either the general manager at the radio station, or it's going to be certainly, the publisher of the paper or the chain of papers, always looking over that editor's shoulder, making sure that they don't put them in jeopardy when it comes to the law. And I think, what we've developed, and maybe it was a blunder by Congress, I'm not sure, but when 230 was put in place, that allowed those entities that could benefit from that exemption to flourish beyond what anybody could have possibly imagined at that time. So even though I know that JCPA is probably got some traction right now, I still think if you just do JCPA and not do 230, you're going to find yourself kind of back in the same place. And I know that that one of the set of testimony today kind of alluded to that. I'm just gonna, the last thing I wanted to ask maybe Mr. Greenwald, because maybe I think you're probably the best position to answer this, but what's your demographic? Who are you trying to get to? Who do you think is most interested in your content? I have 3 sons, and 2 of them are in their 30s, and 1 is 28 years old. I've never seen a newspaper in their hand, but I've also never seen them without their phone in their hand. So, that's a big part of what this discussion has become, I think, is who are these groups? Who are we reaching out to? And does the media feel a responsibility to kind of, tailor their content to these individuals?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it goes back to the point I and several other people were alluding to earlier about the collapse of trust in media. And I think what you said is exactly right, is that as media outlets have confronted an increasingly difficult climate in which to not just profit, but sustain themselves financially, the model to which they've turned is one which feeds partisan audiences, not what they should hear, but what they want to hear, which in turn erodes trust in journalism even further. And I think that until that problem is addressed in terms of what is journalism and the media industry doing that's causing a loss of trust, even if people are still consuming it, these problems are going to continue to linger, and this legislation might actually make that worse.
The time of the gentleman has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Yeah.
I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, the chair of the Intellectual Property Subcommittee, for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for holding this hearing, very important. And I thank the witnesses for being here today. The vitality of a broad, diverse journalism field is imperative to the success of our republic. And any threat to the independent functioning of the Fourth Estate necessitates both intense scrutiny and decisive action from this body. This is why earlier today I asked to join Chairman Cicilline as a co-sponsor of his legislation, the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act of 2021. We should recognize that a free and vibrant press is essential to the workings of our democracy, not just bringing national and international news to the public, but also bringing local news to consumers who need to know what's going on in their local communities. There's a danger in all news becoming nationalized, and I'm afraid that is where we are headed today, given the fact that local news gathering organizations can't afford to stay in business because their ad revenues have dwindled and they have lost control over the publication of their content. Unfair and anti-competitive practices by online platform giants are literally killing the ability of consumers to receive robust and probing local news coverage. Local broadcasters and local print media are trusted sources of news and information for 330 million Americans. And in the Atlanta media market, I'm kept informed about what's going on throughout my district and beyond. They covered news about the civil rights demonstrations in Atlanta last summer and the long lines at the polls last June and again in November. and they continue to provide much needed local airtime on the impact that the pandemic has had on schools, businesses, minority communities, and healthcare in local communities in the Atlanta market. They're keeping us up on what our legislature is trying to do to curtail and limit our right to vote. Today, I stand up for local news gathering organizations. The value of local journalism and the diversity of voices it amplifies is more important now than ever as the public has moved to the online marketplace as the platform through which they receive news coverage. Ad revenue is the mother's milk for all news gathering organizations, and unfortunately for them, that same ad revenue is being siphoned off by the digital platforms that use their content to attract those same ad dollars. This committee's digital market report released last Congress found that two companies have a duopoly over the digital advertising market, Google and Facebook. In particular, the committee found that these two major companies act as gatekeepers, and their decisions on how to display content and any changes to their algorithms can significantly affect the traffic to a news publisher's website. Mr. Shavrin, how does Facebook and Google's ability to act as gatekeepers to news content on their platforms directly affect the viability of news publishers?
Great, thank you very much. One of the things we know about news content is it's highly engaging. People go to Google and Facebook products to find out about what's happening in the world, to get updates, and they do it again the next day and the next day after that. And so it draws a lot of audience. It also, that content acts as an antidote for the platform's misinformation problem. So it benefits the platforms tremendously. And very little of the value, though, is returned to publishers. So at the same time that our content is more important and more valued than ever, there's very little return to actually sustain the creation of it. And that's essentially what we need to fix if we want a future for local news.
Thank you, Mr. Barr, or I'm sorry, Ms. Barr. If Congress is unable to level the playing field, what does the future look like for local news gathering organizations?
Thank you very much for that question. We would probably find ourselves increasingly unable to maintain the level of coverage that we have in our local markets. So when a major event occurs, or even a minor event, we might have fewer people to cover a school board hearing, a government agency that's being critiqued, or we might have trouble with covering a major hurricane. It would just make it more and more difficult for us to cover the markets in which we live and work.
Thank you, Mr. Shavern. How has the enforcement?
I'm sorry, the time of the gentleman has expired.
I thank the chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Owens, for 5 minutes. He was on the screen. There he is.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Thank you for holding this hearing today. And to the witnesses, I really do appreciate you sharing experiences. We've heard a lot today about the council culture invading our society, but I need to say something a little bit more than that. There's a reason why I'm passionately fighting this current council culture, because what I've seen, what counseling a culture truly looks like with my upbringing. Counseling a culture looks like intimidation of young Black students entering University of Alabama to break the back of segregation in 1973. Counseling a culture looks like police and attack dogs waiting at the end of Selma Bridge in 1965. Today, counseling a culture has taken the form of oppressive censorship of big tech silencing American voices and stealing our freedom of speech. As it was in 1960 civil rights days, it will take the same old school Americanism to defeat this curse. It's called courage, backbone, a patriotic bipartisanship, which I'm seeing today, an effort to prioritize our culture of freedom over global profit and power. The enemies of our American culture can be summarized in 2 words, the same words used as the enemies of 1960 freedom fighters, bullies and cowards. To go back to what Thomas Jefferson and one of our founders said, obviously, years ago, at the beginning, Ignorant free, to paraphrase, ignorant free can never be. It's never been more true than it is today. There's been a lot of good questions asked today, and I don't want to duplicate those. So I'm just going to ask Mr. Travis and Mr. Greenwald. You know, this is one of I think of a long series of steps that's going to get us to where we can deal with this process that's been happening to us for quite a while. This counsel culture, counseling a culture, our American culture. How do you see us finally get to that end where we've gotten control? And obviously, this is one of the many steps to get in control to where we can have this freedom of speech again, where we expect this as a country, that this should be a natural process. We can speak freely without feeling of being attacked. How do you see that coming to where we can end this process here in America? Let's start with Mr. Travis and Mr. Greenwald.
It's a great question, Congressman. And to me, every single American out there is terrified on some level every time they pick up Twitter, every time they pick up Instagram, every time they pick up Facebook, and they sit there for a moment and think about whatever opinion they're about to share, and they have to think to themselves, is this worth my life fundamentally changing? And to me, the marketplace of ideas, Congressman, requires that people not be afraid to say what they really think. And what we have created is such a stifled environment today that people are terrified to say what they think. They're also terrified that their kids might have a TikTok video out where they're singing along to a rap song and suddenly they can't get a college scholarship anymore. That's happening every single day across this country. And big tech has helped to create a censorious universe where, again, I said cancel culture to me is the difference between I disagree with you and I disagree with you and you're not even allowed to be involved in this conversation and you shouldn't be allowed to have a job either. And what we have to do if we want to have a full flourishment of democracy is start to fight back against that culture of censorship. And one of the ways that we do it, I believe, is by restricting the antitrust power that I believe the big tech companies have come to take over in the ensuing decade. And I'm sure Glenn can talk about that a lot better even than I can, but that's the essence of the question I think you're asking.
Yeah, thank you.
The one point I'd like to emphasize, Congressman, about all that is big media, the largest media corporations in the United States, are not opposed to the censorious behavior of big tech. Quite the contrary, they're the ones who have agitated for it most aggressively. If you ask people in Silicon Valley, they will tell you they would, all other things being equal, prefer to be out of the business of content moderation and have been pressured by big media companies, both for ideological and competitive reasons, to silence others who might compete with these large outlets in the name of diversity. And this is why I would really urge the committee to strongly consider this. What I think everyone is saying is very valid in this concern for the viability of local media outlets. So if that's the case, the focus ought to be on empowering these local media outlets to sustain themselves and to grow and flourish, and not empower the actors who are causing so many of the problems that we're all talking about, which are big media outlets either acting in concert with big tech or in many cases co-opting the power that they wield.
The time of the gentleman has expired. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And
thank you.
Mr. Greenwald, that's exactly the purpose of the legislation, to empower those small publishers and small newspapers. And Mr. Chairman, I want to start with you. You know, a few years ago, Facebook's head of new partnerships, Campbell Brown, told publishers that if they don't work with Facebook, they will end up, quote, in hospice. She reportedly said, and I quote, "We will help you revitalize journalism, but in a few years, the reverse looks like I'll be holding your hands with your dying business like in hospice," which is pretty powerful language. And our investigation found that Google or Facebook can change an algorithm, and in doing so, can have a devastating impact on traffic to a news publisher's website. One publisher explained an incident where Google made a change to its search algorithm that slashed traffic to the publisher's website by 50%. And so my question for you is, how do these types of incidents affect a news publisher's advertising revenue? And have news publishers raised their concerns directly with Google and Facebook? And if so, what was their response?
Thank you very much. Yeah, that fascinating quote. Yeah, the sad fact is, so many publishers did and have tried to do what Facebook has asked, almost always to their detriment. By the way, interesting example about the role of algorithms in all of this. There's been some really good reporting about after the last presidential election, Facebook made the decision to increase the amount of news from reliable professional news sources. And then they decided to turn it down again. So they actively manage the amount of quality journalism that the public is exposed to, and essentially that determines whether we live or die. These two companies are our regulators. They determine whether we're seen, how we're monitored.
Thank you. And I don't know if we froze or.
So with that, I just say we've tried to work with them, and it hasn't worked out very well.
No, and you add to that a business model that incentivizes the most provocative and exploitative communications that are shared most widely and increase ad revenue. So there's no incentive for that kind of proper curation of their sites. Mr. Smith, thank you again for your testimony. You mentioned in your written testimony transparency requirements, obligations to negotiate in good faith, and a duty to avoid retaliation, as well as some oversight and monitoring by an agency like the FTC. And just wondering if you could share a little bit about what your thoughts are on how we might improve the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act in light of the Australian experience.
Sure. I mean, I might start with the aspects that are most closely related to the negotiation process itself. So, I do think that a duty to negotiate in good faith, and especially an obligation to avoid retaliation, I think are very important. And I think that kind of responsibility usually is subject to an agency review and an FTC or similar agency review to uphold those responsibilities, I think is not just appropriate, but pretty customary. I do think the transparency issue gets back to what you were just talking about. And I think that's going to require some more thought. It's going to require some more discussion. I think in Australia, it became apparent that it was important. It was also a challenging topic. There's a lot of views on both sides that frankly need to be considered. But this is a topic that is of great importance, frankly, around the world.
Thank you so much. Mr. Schluss, you raised some concerns that additional revenue that may be provided to news organizations that are able to negotiate under the JCPA might not be reinvested in producing high-quality news, but rather be used for share buybacks or to further enrich wealthy investors. I think those are really important concerns. And so what safeguards should we be considering adding to this bill to address these concerns?
Well, I think, I'm hearing a lot of terms that I hear in my day job, right? I'm hearing about the imbalance of power and the need to negotiate in good faith in a collective way. And in the past 3 years, we've added 3,500 media workers to our union, which is unprecedented growth. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that the workers are part of this solution, that any additional revenue would be built in to support new jobs at local newsrooms. We also need to make sure that there's neutrality, and that union busting efforts by a lot of these companies, whether it's Gannett, Tribune Publishing, or even Block Communications Incorporated, cease and stop, because these journalists, they just want to do their jobs. They look at their jobs as a public service to their communities, and they don't want to have to also fight the companies to just get the basic respect that they deserve.
Thank you. And I would just note with my couple seconds left that, we all recognize that this is a temporary solution to an urgent problem that we believe we must respond to, and if we don't, we will just not have local journalism anymore. And so this is not something we're doing alone. We have a very robust antitrust agenda with many, many excellent recommendations that we intend to move forward on, and I don't want anyone to be concerned that this is the only thing we're going to do. This is one part of a very discrete problem with a very temporary fix. We have lots more work ahead of us that relate to all the recommendations in the report. And with that, I'm pleased to yield 5 minutes to the ranking member of the subcommittee, the distinguished gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck.
Before my time begins, Mr. Chairman, may I ask a quick question?
Of course.
I think part of the discussion today is about the bill and whether it intends to cover startup organizations and various others. And I just want to mention a few of them, if I may: Daily Caller, Daily Wire, Washington Examiner, Washington Times, Spectator, Blaze, National Review Online, Daily Signal, Breitbart, Federalist, and Mr. Greenwald's former employer, The Intercept. Are those all intended to be covered by the definition that we have in here, news content creator?
Yeah, they are not only intended to be covered, they are covered because it is content neutral, and all of the organizations you described are producers of content.
And when Mr. Breitbart started Breitbart in his garage, would that be covered by this?
Absolutely.
And if there was some doubt about that, would the chair be willing to entertain an amendment to the bill to clarify that when we get to markup?
I am always willing to work with you, Mr. Buck. You have always acted in good faith, and to the extent there are improvements or clarifications of the bill that would be useful, I'm happy to work with you on those.
Thank you very much. Mr. Travis, I'm just an old jock, so I'm more comfortable talking to you than anybody else around here, and I appreciate you being here today. I have to tell you, and you may have been in this situation also, but I have been in disagreements with a spouse, a child, a neighbor, a coworker, and after about 5 minutes of the disagreement, I realize we're saying the same thing. And there's something happening today where I feel like we're saying the same thing, and not just the witnesses, but the members also. You know, what happened to you is disgraceful in this country. It's something we expect in China or Russia. It's not something we expect in the United States of America. And so I absolutely believe the solution to what you talked about is having 5 Googles, 10 Facebooks, 12, and I think Mr. Smith would agree with me. He'd love to have Bing and Google, you know, with equal market share competing against each other in a way that would make sure that if one discriminated against you, the other would pick up that revenue and run with it. But this is something different, I think, what we're talking about with this particular bill. I think what we're talking about with this bill is to make sure that these news organizations that are going out of business have the chance to compete with these big tech giants for ad revenue. Right now, they don't. Right now, what we're seeing, and by the way, big tech doesn't have a bunch of reporters out there covering news stories or opinion writers writing news stories. All they do is they take someone else's product and they use that product for more and more profit for them and less profit or revenue for the other side. And so what I'm wondering is, what is the solution that you would, not to the world in general. We agree, especially on this side of the aisle, that we need to do something about Section 230, and we need to do something about censorship. But in terms of this specific issue, revenue for small local news organizations, what do we do?
There's not an easy solution, right? And there is a multifaceted solution that I think is going to have to be built in order for things like this to work. I think Section 230 needs to be modified in many ways. I also think, to use the specific example that I was talking about, in courts, we have created a system where if a bad judge decision occurs at the district court, you can appeal it to the appeals court or all the way to the Supreme Court. When I look at Facebook, which is a monopoly, let's not pretend that they're anything other than a monopoly. It's almost impossible for news organizations to make budgets without working with Facebook, as Chairman, you just said in the example you used. What I think they need to have is a fair and transparent system when they get things wrong to allow them to be remedied. Because ultimately, I'm going to be fine. But if our company doesn't make the revenue that we should on the content that we're producing, that means that I hire less people. That means that all of these companies that are here talking to you today trying to increase their revenue hire less people as well. And to the extent that I believe in the marketplace of ideas, which I do, we need as many voices as possible all speaking. And the way that the system is structured right now, we are not having that occur.
Mr. Smith, I want to ask you a quick question. I recognize the concern that at some point there'll be this smoky room and a few of the tech giants and a few of the news giants will get together and say, hey, we can make even more money if we just decide to screw all these other people, the smaller tech companies and the smaller news organizations. And so the idea that these two giants are going to collude and create something with the exemption that we're talking about in this bill may be real. But I want to ask you, in your experience with Australia, did Google say to the world, hey, let's just get together with 3 or 4 of these news organizations. The Australian people will be happy And that's the way to go. Did they act like they were willing to collude with just a few, or were they concerned with the welfare of the people of Australia?
Well, it's a great question, and interestingly, as things played out in Australia, I think it's fair to say that there was initially a principal concern that, frankly, the only news organizations that would benefit would be the big ones, and specifically News Corp and two others. And the whole assurance that the law contained to ensure that everyone was reached was exactly what is in the JCPA, the ability for everyone to negotiate collectively. I actually think that if you don't create a basis for small publishers to negotiate collectively, you really don't create much of a basis for them to negotiate effectively.
I appreciate the time, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now would like to add the following items for the record. A letter from Jason Kint, the CEO of Digital Content Next, a statement for the record from Jeff Jarvis, the Leonard Tao Professor of Journalism and Innovation at the New York's Craig Network Graduate School of Journalism. Statement for the record from Maribel Perez Wadsworth, President of News Gannett Media. A statement for the record from Rod Sims, Chair of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. A statement for the record from Media Matters for America. A statement from the record from our colleague, Congresswoman Susan Wild, who in her statement acknowledges, and I quote, "These challenges are real, and those of us in positions of power must take them seriously," and recounts her mother's own experience as a journalist. A joint statement for the record from the National Association of Black-Owned Broadcasters, Native American Journalists Association, and Radio, Television, Digital News Association. A statement for the record from the Free Press Action. A statement from the record from Google. And a statement for the record from Matthew Shears, President of Computer and Communications Industry Association. And with that, I'd like to really thank our extraordinary panel of witnesses for your testimony today. I think this was a very productive hearing and raised very important issues about this urgent challenge we face. Next Thursday, we will be holding our third hearing as part of a series to develop legislation to address the rise and abuse of market power online. At that hearing, our witnesses will discuss proposals to modernize and strengthen the antitrust laws that apply monopoly power and anti-competitive mergers. And again, with deep gratitude to our witnesses, and without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. And this hearing is now adjourned.